Whoops, couldn't find my mouse. Hello, defense innovators, and welcome back to day 2 of Defense Academy. I'm Sean Duffy, your MC for today. We've got a lot of really great stuff on tap for you today. Yesterday, we had some awesome speakers who shared really great information about SBIR, open topics, intellectual property, and really just a lot of opportunities to network and meet others. So I hope you took full advantage of that and that you also took notes. So today, we're going to hear from Chandler Hall, who is an expert on cybersecurity, among other things. Lots of really great information in his chat. And also Heather Richman, who will be closing out the day to share her experiences working with the DoD. Really everything that you need to know to set yourself on a track to work with the government, work with our defense partners. So really exciting stuff. This is day 2 of 3. Make sure that you tune in tomorrow. We have another really great day of programming lined up for you. And throughout the day today, if you have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. We've got folks who are standing by to answer any questions that you might have and help you, get down, working down that path towards defense innovation. And so with that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Chandler Hall, who is a cybersecurity evangelist, to share his discussion on cybersecurity maturity model certification, or CMMC. And with that, turn it over to Chandler.
I want to say that I really appreciate being invited in from Capital Factory for doing a Defense Academy presentation. Centaur is excited to be a participant in the San Antonio area. We always look for opportunities to educate and to help the cyber world increase its expertise, because we definitely need to have more and more folks in this part of the industry. It's something that I cannot stress the importance of in our national security. So I want to start off with the CMMC overview with this big red note, which is that there is not an organization today. That everyone that's looking at CMMC today is worrying about their formal accreditation. And I think it's important to say that here today, and this time period is end of October 2020, that there still is not any designated organization that can come out and accredit your organization. There are some trained assessors now, the provisional ones. There's about 50 of them. I think they do another, I think there is another class going on this week as we speak. So there should be about 70 or so of these folks available to look at doing your accreditation for maturity level 1. It will likely not be until early next year before we see any assessors that can begin that effort for maturity level 3, which we'll talk about those different levels. And they have not designated any of the companies that will be official organizations that can provide that accreditation. Those organizations will be called C3PAOs, as we'll see in other slides. So I do want to just give you a warning. There are plenty of organizations out there on the internet that will tell you differently and will sell you something that you probably aren't wanting to buy right now. You can get help. That's a good thing, but don't think you're getting a formal accreditation anytime this month or next month, and probably not through the end of 2020. So what is the CMMC? Well, it's a maturity model. What we've had in terms of driving federal contractors to better and better cybersecurity compliance in the past has been the DFARS 252.204 regulation. That's the actual thing that's on contracts. The DFARS regulation, up until recently, has only called out one standard called NIST Special Publication 800-171. We'll touch on some of those in the next few slides as well. But those fell short, as we'll see, and they deemed it was critical and important enough to come up with a new methodology of compliance. They've created a maturity model. They've separated themselves somewhat from a NIST standard. It is the thing that maybe will allow, we hopefully will allow for a faster, quicker addressing of problems as we see them occur out in the field, such that we don't have to go through as lengthy a process to adopt and change a standard as they may have to do by adopting new practices into the CMMC model. So it's a cybersecurity compliance requirement only because the DFARS 252.204.252 rule makes it so, okay? But it isn't a requirement itself. It's really the model of how you're going to increase your cybersecurity compliance, right? There are 5 levels, as you can see here on the slide. The easiest level, CMMC level 1, is in essence made up of 17 controls 14, I think 15 of those controls have been around for years, already in your contracts. If you've been doing federal business, you have had a clause and a FAR clause, a Federal Acquisition Regulation clause, that has directed you to have certain level of cybersecurity. There were 15 little things you had to do, you know, have good passwords and things of that nature. Pretty simple stuff, right? And that's what these 17 are at maturity level 1. That's the minimum that you'll have to have going forward. And by 2025, by October 1st, 2025, every federal DoD contractor will have to have at least a CMMC level 1 accreditation, okay? The design of this model is to help us protect a certain type of information. That information has been discussed and understood in the DFARS regulation and that NIST 800-171 model standard I talked about. It's been understood as CUI, controlled but unclassified information. Classified information, secret and top secret type stuff, that has its own level of controls, its own level of handling and what you have to do, its own rules and regulations, right? So this is everything that sits just below that, but it's really important information. And matter of fact, has been the issue with, say, the Chinese able to steal all of our F-35 fighter plane plans. They did a lot of it through pulling out pieces of the puzzle, which were CUI type pieces of data from our own contractors in order to basically produce the same plane within a matter of months of us producing it. So it may have even been weeks. It's been a few years since I really remember the dates. So it's critical. It's really important, right? What I think is the folk, I want everybody that if you have no understanding of CMMC, if you have a small understanding of CMMC, these next few slides are going to at least give you the things to kind of hone in on and understand where you need to focus, right? So it is designed to increase the protection of this stuff. This CUI, if you would. The Department of Defense actually had a different name for CUI that they've been referring to in their contracts. They called the same exact stuff controlled defense information, as you can see there on the second to the last bullet. Okay, they did that because the Department of Defense got ahead of the rest of the federal government in terms of the importance and urgency of protecting this type of data. And since they recognized that way back in 2010, when this was first looked at and addressed, how do we protect our information better? Part of the challenge was that throughout the federal government, we had a ton of different acronyms that had slightly different handling requirements, which, to be frank, the analysis of some of our problems was that was just too confusing. It wasn't standardized enough. And so they decided that we did need to have an all-encompassing classification of that data, which is now called CUI. And they have got a CUI registry online where you can look up different flavors and different types of CUI. I mentioned just a couple of them here, ITAR, and for official use only, you may have seen these types of markings. ITAR, of course, if you have ITAR restricted data, you're under additional restrictions beyond CMMC, but it is also considered a subset of this CUI nomenclature, okay? So it's important that you know that. In the creation of the CMMC, since they looked at the problem, which we'll see here in a second, they decided, however, that we did have a different type of information as well called federal contractor information. And FCI is really even sits below in terms of importance to the CUI data, but it's just basically considered the communications that you have back and forth on a particular contract with your government agency. That information is classified as FCI. And the reason it probably became important for them to classify it as a name is because I mentioned that maturity level 1 has a very simple set of controls. You're not handling CUI if you're maturity level 1. So what are you protecting? Why do you need to do it? And there's really why they came up with FCI. So it's just a way for them to have an anchor or a single thing they can talk about that tries to communicate the importance as you move up the maturity levels, right? So who is going to need to go get accredited, receive their formal CMMC accreditation? There is a defined process. It has recently been formally introduced, as we'll see later in the presentation, by updating this DFARS 252.204 regulation. They've updated that. It's now an interim rule that goes into effect on November the 30th of 2020. And based on that interim rule, they've now introduced legally and formally what the CMMC is, what the schedule is, what you have to do, how you go about appealing a decision if you're not happy with it, who's responsible for doing what piece of this CMMC accreditation. All that is now defined, as we'll see a little bit later. Who has to get accredited has not changed. The CMMC has been discussed now for over a year. All the public information available in webinars like this pretty much is borne out to be what they've delivered in the updated interim rule. And so they have defined previously that all DoD organizations that want to pursue and win a new DoD contract must at least be formally accredited at CMMC maturity level 1. Okay, that's primes, that's subs, that's everybody. The only people that are selling to the Department of Defense going forward, once CMMC is placed on all contracts, the only type of organization that can sell into the Department of Defense that does not need a CMMC accreditation will be what we call commercial off-the-shelf suppliers, as noted on that last bullet. So if you're selling copier toner or office supplies to the Department of Defense in your state, you don't have to go get that accreditation if that's all you do in terms of your Department of Defense business. Okay. So what level is required? Well, I've alluded to it already. Okay. Maturity level 1 and maturity level 2, which kind of sits in limbo land, really only involves this federal contractor information, communications back and forth, procedural reports, things like that you're doing, where, you know, we just don't want that just freely available to anybody in the world. So they're going to classify those FCI, and they want to help you recognize that there's a level of cybersecurity, even with that less complex or less critical data, that you still need to be trying to do certain things to protect it. Okay. Maturity level 1 is where the majority of DoD contractors, there's approximately 300,000 of those, 285, I think is the last number I've heard. 85% of those 300,000-ish contractors will be at maturity level 1. So this really won't be much of an impact at all to the vast majority of contractors. However, those contractors that have been handling CUI data, and especially the ones that have recognized over the past few years that they should have been implementing higher and higher cybersecurity practices in their organization by adopting and implementing all of the NIST 800-171 controls that I've referenced already, to follow their DFARS regulation on their contracts. Those folks that have ignored doing that, that have done the bare minimum of doing that, obtaining your CMMC maturity level 3 accreditation is going to be quite challenging. So I will reiterate throughout this presentation how your best possible preparation for getting your formal accreditation, which is in essence a third-party audit, is to focus on getting your DFARS required NIST 800-171 controls implemented and done correctly. So that's where you can best focus to prepare for maturity level 3. If you potentially if you're handling a type of data that the Department of Defense would call high value assets or HVA type data. So this gets into very, very critical data that you need to control that sits just under classified data. That high value asset data will drive your organization to have to formally get accredited under maturity level 4 or possibly even 5. And those could be expensive and time consuming to get to that spot if you're not already well down that path. So ask your program managers that are working, that manage the contracts you have with the Department of Defense, do we receive high value asset type information? Can you ask your government KO, your contracting officer, if that's the type of data that they would consider on this contract, a future version of that contract, if it were to be recompeted, would therefore probably have a CMMC maturity level requirement of 4 or 5, and those will be tough. The good news is, the estimation from the Department of Defense is that barely over 0.5% of those 285,000 contractors will be required to meet CMMC level 4 or 5. Something like 0.6% of the contractor base will need to be at that level. Okay, so fingers crossed, you're only at maturity level 3. That's enough of a challenge for 2020 and 2021. So we'll hope to keep in that. I'm going to have some slides, as you can see, as I go through this presentation. I've done this before for the Defense Academy recently, and yet this is a moving target. So rather than just kind of delete things, I thought it might be interesting to the audience where I've done strikeouts of stuff that maybe was previously believed to be correct based on various webinars of pundits and folks in the know that were, for whatever reason, not done exactly that way as the interim rule came out last month. So we had all believed that maybe the whole NIST 800-171 part would get replaced. That is absolutely not what has occurred in the interim rule. Maybe out in 2026 or something, they'll finally do away with it. But I don't think so, because it is a NIST standard, right? So we may see the NIST standard adopt new things as they learn and see other attacks and such going on in the industry. They may increase, improve, or reduce NIST 171. CMMC, being a model, cherry picks the type of they need, and that's kind of being a little facetious, because they took all 110 of the controls out of NIST 171 and called them practices in the CMMC model, because you got to change the name, right? Terminology. So so it is important to recognize that NIST 800-171 still exists. It's a standard that you've got to abide by. It's called out by your DFARS current contractual regulations on your current contracts. As the interim DFARS rule comes along and is put on contracts, on new contracts that you're pursuing, you'll still see that probably sitting out there, okay, because you'll have some that do this and some that do that. But as we see more and more CMMC added to contracts, I think eventually we might see that requirement go away. We'll see. Only time will tell on that one, okay? It also, we've talked about in the past that we knew a third-party accredited organization called a C3PAO will have to come in to assist. So here's what I don't have as a slide to try to get more information about CMMC into this particular presentation. The one thing that the DFARS rule ended up doing as they got closer and closer to the deadline was they gave relief to contractors. They felt like more time was needed. And so what they decided in the fall of 2017, even though at the end of December 2017, the DFARS rule was supposed to take fully into effect, and the NIST 800-171 standard was supposed to be 100% implemented, they chose to allow contractors instead to do a gap analysis, define all the stuff they're doing correct in the system security plan, and the stuff that they're not doing correct, they put down in their system security plan that they have a problem that they're working on, and to look at that for more information, to look in their plan of action and milestones. So you see that third bullet, no POA and M allowed. Okay, so up until CMMC, you could take some of the worst problems that you had, put them on a spreadsheet, call that your plan of action and milestones, and say that you're going to get around to that as soon as you can, but you're struggling with it, and maybe you're not doing it very, very aggressively. Maybe you're not doing it at all right now, right? And so the Department of Defense saw several problems occurring. First of all, we weren't increasing the cybersecurity practices that we needed to increase. That was the intent of it, right? So we had more and more contractors kind of going, yeah, that looks expensive. I'm not real sure. This is maybe something else is going to happen. Oh, I've heard about the new CMMC coming next year. Maybe that'll change things. Let's sit around and wait. Okay. So I've got a POAM that legally allows me to sit around and wait, and I'm self-assessing myself. That was one of the other challenges of the DFARS rule. No one's checking me. There's no failing grade here. So I'm good with that. Okay. Well, the Department of Defense recognized the second problem they had with that. Not only was cybersecurity not being improved, but the contractors that were winning the contracts were the worst cybersecurity clients out there. They were because they had low rates. They didn't spend any money on cybersecurity. They didn't have to hire anybody or deploy better firewalls or whatever. So they had less of a RAP rate hit. Whereas the companies that went full bore and implemented everything had higher rates. So they were in a competitive disadvantage, even though that was the type of contractor the Department of Defense needed to use. So that was unacceptable. And then I think a person that probably many people do know about is, her name is Katie Arrington. She was hired into the Department of Defense and in the acquisition area for the DoD, and had been competing like myself with other DoD contractors. I'm a biz dev person. my title is cybersecurity evangelist, right? She did the same kind of stuff. We actually knew each other. I mentioned Charleston earlier. That's where she was living, and I've been to those trade shows. She's quite the firecracker, right? She was sick and tired of losing to people that didn't do the job right. And so she championed this. She took this flag, ran up that hill, and is still running up that hill as a champion for, we do need to do this better. Okay, so that's where we are today. As you can see in the last bullet, they were saying by 2026. It's really the same thing. They're now literally defined October 1st, 2025. That's, of course, the beginning of the 2026 fiscal year for the government. They run September to October, or I guess October to September. So you'll see some of these updates out here. I noticed that one striked out bullet in the middle, there were supposed to be some RFIs that had popped out already by this time that defined which contracts would have CMMC requirements as RFPs when they came out. I am not aware of any RFI that have done that. I have seen other non-DOD things like the GSA STARS 3 proposal come out and mention that CMMC will be required in the future. They put a placeholder in the spot there, right? Heads up, they did that so they don't have to pay you for doing this work in the future, because they told you before you pursued that contract that you would have to be doing CMMC. That's why they wrote it in ahead of the actual CMMC requirements. So why create it? Well, I think I've alluded to it a couple of times, so you can check these slides out later. You can go back to Capital Factory under the Defense Academy. You'll have access to these slides as well. But indeed, the DOD said, look, we made those changes. We felt we had to make those changes in the fall of 2017. By 2018, 2019, they recognized that that was unacceptable. What had occurred based on that was disappointing to them. So they decided they needed to fix it. Well, while they were fixing it, folks like myself were brought into that decision early on at the Pentagon about what are the real problems. Since my company has helped 100 companies meet their compliance, we are this third-party type assessor organization. I am the evangelist for our GRC, Governance Regulation Compliance Group. One of the things that they caught on to was it was a single peg shoved in a weird hole, right? Every contractor had to meet the same 110 controls in NIST 800-171. And I'm going to be frank, that was way overkill and was such a disservice to those 285,000 contractors that do things like in my town, there's a contractor that had to meet NIST 800-171, and they make flags, American flags. They take disabled veterans, they give them a job, and they sew American flags, and they sell those to the Department of Defense, like put on Navy ships. Okay, why in the world would they need to have that level of cybersecurity? They don't. So in developing the CMMC model, they talked early on about how it was going to reduce costs, and it does. It reduces the cost of those companies that were being forced into implementing a much higher level of cybersecurity than they need. Okay, so it's dramatically reduced the cost of the 285,000 or so that will be only maturity level 1. 85% of those, right? The other 15%, however, your costs are going up. They just are, right? Because you have to now have an audit that you're going to pay someone to do, and you've got a few extra practices at maturity level 3, including maybe stiffer requirements and documentation. Okay, so there's no maybe to that. There's a lot more documentation requirements at maturity level 3 than there were under NIST 800-171. We'll talk about that, right? So, but the beauty is, as we go forward, and at least by 2025, October 1st, all companies going after business, pursuing business against each other for DoD contracts, we'll have a much more level playing field from a price structure throughout, because everyone will be held to the appropriate and same standard. You'll be audited by an accredited organization. You'll receive your accreditation. You will be concerned, you should be concerned about building your teams as you go after new contracts with the right group of folks with those formal accreditations. And all of the CMMC model and structure and organization have been set up around that intent. Okay. So, is getting a CMMC level 3 cheaper to implement? Absolutely not. Okay. I'm just going to rip that Band-Aid right off. It is an audit. Okay, we don't call them that. There's various reasons why we don't call them accreditations and things of that nature. But as lay people, you might as well just think of this as an audit. Okay, people can come in, access your systems, make you prove that what you say you're doing. All right, and they're going to review your documentation, and they're going to question areas that you're weak in, and they're going to make you hit the same bar that they make everyone hit. And there are more controls. So if there's more organizations involved, more people and time involved, and more controls involved, you know it's going to cost you more money. Okay. Hopefully, however, you've been one of the good companies that have been working on those 110 requirements all along under NIST 800-171, and the lift to get to CMMC maturity level 3 will not be as dramatic. Okay. Second bullet, though, got to tell you, this one hurts. If you're using an IT outsource, if you're using an MSP, you need to be bringing to them your requirements that you're under going forward. You need to make sure they are signed up to also implementing and getting a formal CMMC accreditation at the same level you're at. Think about it. They're your system administrators. They have access to all of your systems. They have access to all of your data. Therefore, they need to meet all of the same compliance requirements. Can't stress how that seems to be logical, right? You've got to have them do that. We still have a few questions remaining in my area. I would love to be able to say, here's how you go about it. Get your MSP to do theirs first, and then you should do yours. Maybe you were going to do yours, and then we're going to do your MSP. But if we do yours and your MSP is not delivering on certain things, you can't get yours. So there's a chicken and egg thing here. You might as well crack that egg right now, right? Get with them, have meetings, ask them what they know about it, ask them if they intend to do that. And if they don't, start looking for someone else who will. You need to shore up this area, because I think this area is going to be one of the tougher, because generally it's companies that have chosen not to get invested as a core competency in cybersecurity and IT administration by outsourcing the problem to someone else. That's great, but that someone else has to now meet the same requirements that you need to meet. Okay? So how's this going to pan out? This is an old slide. I didn't want to update it because, to be frank, beyond the end of this year, we don't have much detailed granular visibility still. And so this is actually a slide. And again, like striking out things that have changed, I tend to like to push and show things that are different from what we originally had. And I think you'll see that now. I've been telling in presentations for the past 6 months, I think we're about 2 months delayed, and we're now kind of seeing that in fruition, right? So we were supposed to train the first batch of potentially 50 assessors, CMMC assessors, in the July timeframe. They did their first 25-person class end of September. They did their next 25, end of August. They did their next 25 end of September. They're doing their last 25 this week. So they've slipped in that. We don't have any C3PAOs assigned yet. We don't have any of those RFIs that were supposed to come out in that July timeframe. We are beginning, there are some of the RFPs or contracts that are being discussed and looked at by these assessors under training. They're actually doing pilot projects of existing contracts under the CMMC assessment model to get their training. So all of this has slipped out. What I can definitively say is that most companies are probably not facing a CMMC maturity level 3 accreditation until at best this time next year. Okay, there'll be a few, maybe 1,000 total contractors will have to get some CMMC accreditation. Some of those will be maturity level 1. It should be fairly straightforward and easy. Okay, and even today, I don't think there's a company that's officially accredited at maturity level 1. Now that we have some assessors, Katie Arrington has stated at a previous webinar, I think last month, that the Department of Defense will accept the accreditation from one of those assessors at maturity level 1. So you can go ahead and start that process today if you want to get out ahead of it. But I don't think it's critical to worry about it too much this year, other than staying focused on getting your controls and practices implemented. So how's it going to roll out? Well, there is an organization been created for months called the CMMC Accreditation Board. They are a nonprofit. They are not part of the Department of Defense. They are basically the group that was given the charter to populate itself from industry people and to build up the rules and regulations and processes on how they will manage this accreditation model. Okay, so the board has been created. They've had working groups. They've created their training curriculum. They've trained several of them. They're modifying, evaluating, modifying, and enhancing that training. And as they get through this last batch this week, they will take away from that the final pieces of the provisional period we're under now, where they are openly looking at research, recognizing that things will need to be adjusted and tweaked slightly. And once they've done that, they will then license this job of training thousands of assessors and accrediting companies. They'll take that and they'll actually push that out to professional training organizations who will do the formal accreditations like they do for CISSPs today. Okay, that'll be occurring early next year. I'm not sure we'll see much in January, but hopefully we'll see some of that happening in January. We should start to see a volume of accreditors start to receive their accreditations at maturity level 1. Then they'll have to go back to class and take a test for maturity level 3. Then they'll have to go back and take classes for 4 and 5 once those are available. The only thing they're doing today is 1 through 3. So hopefully we'll start to see more and more assessors be able to be popping out. So there'll be more companies that can offer that service of doing your accreditation. The more companies that are out there doing it, the more assessors that are out there doing it, the lower those costs will come down. That's what we saw with DFARS and NIST accreditations, where people turned to third-party organizations. Those started out as high as 35 to 50 grand to help you do that work. Today, you could probably get a good chunk of that stuff done under 10. All right, definitely under 20. So, so we've seen as competition arises in the great capitalist world we live in, price comes down, everyone benefits. We'll see more and more of that as with the CMMC as well. So they have their provisional accreditations. We're going to have some provisional organizations called C3PAOs for some time period. Once they have rolled out the formality of that, then those will become official. Centaur is a company that's going to become a C3PAO as soon as we're able to. We've turned in all of our paperwork and meet the requirements and sent the checks kind of stuff. And so they're doing this through random selections at times, right now. And so you notice they originally said they were going to train 60 provisional assessors. They've actually now saying 72. And I think that this is important. The initial contracts that will be coming out late this year and early next year that will have this requirement are in nuclear modernization, missile defense, and in some SBIRs and STTRs, which are small business and innovative research contracts, and the ones that you do with universities are the STTRs. I suspect that it won't be all SBIRs. It'll be the ones that are kind of like these, research for nuclear modernization, research on missile defense. Maybe it'll be research on biometrics and bioweaponry and other things that maybe we've learned at how dangerous a pandemic can be. There's a lot of conspiracy theories that China did this on purpose, right? So I would imagine SBIRs and STTRs might address that, right? We should hope so, I think. Wouldn't hurt. I say, what do we got to lose, right? So who's going to do what, right? I've mentioned the CMMC AB. They will license the professional training organizations. The professional training organizations will conduct classes and will have tests so that they are formally creating certified assessors or CAs, and the junior part of that team, certified professionals. So eventually Centaur hopes to have several certified assessors and multiples of certified professors, where if I have a small to medium-sized business organization, we'd have a single CA or a CA with some CPs that do that accreditation. Large organizations that we address, we have some primes who are our contracts as well. They would probably be not only multiple CA and PA teams going in different divisions, but they might even have different C3PAOs. There could be a Centaur and 3 others like me that are all doing the same accreditation, working together in this co-opetition world we find ourselves in more and more, right? To help a major prime like a Lockheed or a BAE or Northrop Grumman get their accreditation level. You can imagine the effort that's going to take in as many different labs and different organizations, different divisions that they have. There's going to be teams of these people, right? So the professional organizations will create those individuals. The CMMC AB will decide who meets the requirements of a company to be a C3PAO. I can't have foreign ownership. I have to meet an ISO 17021 cyber security auditing methodology model, a quality model, if you would. Centaur today meets that. But it's those kind of things that the CMMC AB will still manage. They will review our organization, but they won't be the ones that accredited us. We also have to be audited, and the people that will audit us will be the DCMA, who today is conducting NIST 800-171 audits. So it won't be much of a stretch for them to start doing at minimums ML3 level accreditations for companies like Centaur. And it makes sense for this, right? You can see this, right? So I'm going to go out as an organization, a C3PAO, and accredit a bunch of contractors. What if a new C3PAO wanted to become, a new company wanted to become a C3PAO? It wouldn't make a lot of sense to have me be responsible for accrediting them, because I wouldn't accredit any of them, right? I mean, I'm joking, but you could see that's a conflict of interest. They would be a competitor once they got their accreditation. I'm sure going to really put screws on them, right? And put my best people on that one, right? So obviously they need to use a third-party neutral organization there, and they've chosen to use the best one, the DCMA organization, right? I have had a dozen clients, our clients, go through prior to today NIST 800-171 medium and high confidence level assessments. And those teams that they send to do that are very good at their job. And I think we're going to see C3PAO's assessors will be similar quality, right? So there's a name or an acronym for you out there in the audience. If you are an organization seeking certification, you now have an acronym, OSC. That's you. Okay, so you'll have to be accredited by one of my assessor teams, and not really just Centaur's, but any C3PAO's assessor team, right, in order to get your certification. But what we would do is we would recommend to the CMMC AB through documentation that we have done the job as trained to validate that you meet all of your compliance requirements, and we are recommending that the CMMC AB awards you your certification. So the actual certification award comes from them. And we will see later the new updated interim rule, how they've given us an understanding of what if you aren't happy with your C3PAO's results. So that's a teaser. You got to wait till the end of the presentation to find out a little bit more about that. So what does it cost? Okay, everybody's asked me for years, what's this going to cost me? What's this going to cost me? I'll point out there's kind of two big buckets here, right? There's the what's it cost me to understand how bad off I am, and what's it cost me to not be so bad off, right? There's the assess me, help me understand, or pay for my formal accreditation. There's the cost of getting everything correctly configured and implemented so that I can meet that audit or accreditation. So sometimes in the past, you might pay someone to come in and help you understand the rules, and then pay someone to help you fix the things they told you were broken. You may do that still, but now you're going to have a final piece, which is now get a C3PAO to come formally accredit you. Okay, similar to if you're a software development organization that's been developing software for the federal government, you might have understood that it would be a good thing to get a CMMI formal audit or accreditation. And you might want to go a lot of good, a lot of the bigger DoD business wants you to be at CMMI level 3. Little pro tip here, the CMMC model is fundamentally structured like CMMI. So if you've been through those, you kind of have an understanding of how that works out, okay? I didn't really address how much is this going to cost. In general, the industry on LinkedIn that talks about this publicly, and I would agree with this, in our knowledge that we have today, and we still have real serious lacking pieces, like is there a formal requirement that more than one assessor individual is required to do an ML3 accreditation? We don't know the answer to that question yet. So it's really hard for me to say what my costs are going to be to you if I'm not sure whether I got to send 2 people or 1 person or 3 people. Obviously, that's a problem for us to say cost. But a lot of companies are today saying you should, if you would budget in around $25,000 to get your CMMC level 3 accreditation, you're probably not far off. You may save some money, you may pay a little bit more money, but that seems to be the sweet spot where most organizations are coming to a consensus. Okay. What about your maturity level 1 clients? Well, Katie Arrington started off this process a year ago saying, we got to make it so that the vast majority of DoD contractors are not spending more than $1,000 a year. Okay. Well, heads up, you have to get reaccredited every 3 years at maturity level 1 and 3. So if I meet Katie's intended goal and I charge you $2,500 for a maturity level 1 accreditation, that's spread out over 3 years and you're below that $1,000 a year. Now, I'm not saying that's what it's going to cost you. It should be cheaper than that. I really do think it should be a lot cheaper than that. And it ought to be. It's only 17 controls. It can't take that long to prepare the reports. It can't take that long to do the assessment. We do those a lot, and they should be well below that $1,000 requirement to do that. Okay. It's the maturity level 3 ones that are going to pay a little bit more money. I think everybody kind of gets that, right? All right. I have a lot of costs that you'll see on that previous slide. I have costs to participate as an organization. I have multiple levels of cost for all of the individuals that I get trained to do the work. All of that's going to get rolled off and passed out to all the clients, right? So you can recognize there are a lot of constraints there. So what does it cost your organization to comply or be compliant? That's harder to say, okay? I would say that based on experience of the NIST 800-171, small and medium-sized business could spend as low as $15K and might spend as much as $75K, depending on where they started from. So we've dealt with a lot of virtual organizations in this past year or so that have no brick or mortar. They have no, they don't even have laptops for their individual employees. They literally have their employees use their own personal laptops. Okay. Well, they'll find that as they try to adopt the better practices as required all the way up to the 110 at maturity at NIST 800-171, and as they shift to maturity level 3 and CMMC, that's just going to probably fall short. Still kind of doable maybe, but you're going to have employees resist what they'll have to do on their own personal laptops to make that doable. A lot of companies are looking at that going, we just better buy a bunch of laptops and make those company provided. So depending on where you start, you're going to have higher controls. You might be closer to that 50 to 75K range. If you're already a decently cyber secure environment, you might only be spending 15 for a new SIM tool, a new console that helps you manage your log files appropriately, right? So I think here I also mentioned some of the other levels here, and I think that you can kind of apply most of how that goes along. I have this slide in here really for folks that are confused about the terminology change between NIST 800-171. They called those practice controls. Under CMMC, we now call the same exact rule or requirement, we now call them practices for some reason. This is just giving you, when you see something like CA or SC.3.183, kind of helps you break down what that really means, right? I don't think it's relevant to today's presentation too much, but I put it in the slide deck because people get confused, okay? So, assuming you might know some about NIST 800-171 and you're really concerned about the new stuff that you're going to be required to do in CMMC level 3, this was a lot of the questions that I would get over the past 6 months about what's this going to do to us. I've got a few slides here that kind of give you an idea of the new requirements above and beyond NIST 800-171. The first one I mentioned just a second ago, you have to have a true all-encompassing SIM, an appliance that basically collects all the log files, whether they're the different desktop and laptop login log files, who's trying to hack your PC over in the corner, whether it's log files from your firewall, whether it's maybe a switch log file or an email server log file. They aggregate all that stuff, time correlate it, and with rules preset in place, you're not constantly being bugged by essentially false positives that you have to go investigate. The things that it'll pop out and tell you need to investigate, you need to investigate, right? So that's the reason they want you to get a SIM. It's humanly impractical to actually believe you can do this with human labor. And I'll tell you, we've had some of our clients who chose not to deploy a SIM as we recommended, go through their NIST 800-171 high confidence assessments, and were failed because they did not have that they didn't have sufficient ability to correlate all of the log files by saying our system admin looks at that weekly. That was a finding that they had to address in a corrective action report within 30 to 90 days. Okay, so heads up on all of these things. Spam, email protections, many of us have better than we need to have under the NIST 800-171 regulation because spam is just horrible, and it helps our employees be more productive if we filter that better. But now there's a requirement to do that, okay? There's a requirement to now scan or review code that you are developing, which should hit home to a lot of people listening to this. We're going to talk more about that, okay? So 130 practices are required for you to be implemented and done in CMMC level 3. That's 20 more than the 110 controls. And those 20 I've got on these slides. We call them the Delta 20 in my organization, right? So of the new 20, you are likely already doing these 10, okay? Depending on how you did the 110 controls under NIST 171, you're probably doing these 10. We think 75, 80% of our clients already were doing these 10 once we went back and started doing CMMC readiness reviews, if you would, helping them plan, figure out where they needed to be, right? These 5 practices, maybe 50% of how our clients implemented them meant they were already doing these as well, okay? So the real 5 you really want to probably take a hard look at are these 5, okay? Email forgery protections. Are you reviewing your software, your code, right? There's another, utilize sandboxing, okay, for malicious email. Excuse me one second. We do that at Centaur. And the program that we use drives me nuts because when I receive a PowerPoint from some other vendor, or I receive a PDF from a client with links in it, or I receive, other types of content attachments where they have either a URL hot link inside it, or a macro, or just a PowerPoint, it gets modified in a sandbox such that when I receive a PowerPoint from people, I don't receive the actual PowerPoint. I receive JPEG screenshots of the PowerPoint slide. I can't go in there and edit the text, right? Now, I can request, that happens automatically really quick because it's not sent through a sandbox. If that doesn't work for me, I can request the original files, and after some time period, I'll receive the originals because they're dropping those attachments into a sandbox and really aggressively throwing artificial intelligence stuff at it to see if there's something malicious in there to eliminate that problem, okay? So those are 5 that you really probably want to take a good look at, right? So usually at this point, I'm getting near the end of a CMMC presentation, and I'm saying, hey, here were the beliefs that we had, right? So some of these things have changed. Most of this stuff is still the way we believed it to be a few months ago. But let's move into the new interim DFARS rule. I have 3 more slides, so hang in here with me, right? The DoD has now updated the DFARS 252.204 rule. Even though it's called an interim rule, it doesn't mean it's temporary like the definition of interim. It is the law, and it takes effect on November the 30th, right? They've created 3 new subsections, DFARS 7019, 7020, and 7021. So we've all been talking about DFARS 7012. By the way, that's still in existence. It's still applicable. It's still a regulation, just like DFARS 7008 and 7010. Those are additive. These are additive, right? You have to do them as well as those, okay? So what they are telling you, and the real heads up in bold, so anything you see in bold over the next few slides, you really need to drill into it. If you don't understand it, contact me, right? You have to actually now turn in your self-assessment DFARS score. There's an algorithm that you follow that's put out by the DCMA. I have a calculator I'm going to show you here in a second that you can go to and freely calculate your score. You've got to turn that in, okay? And you need to have that in place by November 30th. Even though the interim rule doesn't take effect until November 30th, come December 1st, if there's a contract that's being awarded December 1st, you have to have your score registered with the DoD in this particular system. We'll see in just a second, right? So real important, get on that right away. If you need help coming up with that scoring, contact someone like Centaur. We'll help you get that done, right? But in general, this new interim rule created a 2-pronged process. They're going to strengthen the NIST 800-171 compliance, and they've introduced the formality, the legal formal requirement of CMMC, so they can now start to flow into contracts. Let's drill into these newest kids on the block, right? 7019 basically says you now have to score your DFARS implementation and you have to register it. Okay, so that's that new heads up I mentioned a second ago. We're going to see that in a second in detail. 7020 defines and changes this NIST 800-171 DFARS old 7012 stuff. There's now a basic, medium, and high assessment classification. Basic is what we've had all along. Self-assess yourself. Now you have to have a score. Now you have to have it registered. But it's a basic self-assessment, okay? But the agency that has awarded you this contract that you are now just now getting may deem the type of CUI data that they'll be flowing to you and your subcontractors as more important than that. So they may say, you know what, that self-assessment is not good enough for us. This is too critical CUI data. We're going to want to look at your system security plan. We're going to want to evaluate your plans and policies. We're going to want to talk with your personnel as to how they're doing certain things that we don't think we can tell from this system security plan. There is no POAM anymore, so everything's got to be implemented, right? So it is essentially a non-audited audit. In other words, they're going to talk to you and ask you, what are you doing here? How are you doing that? But they're not going to make you prove it by allowing them to log in or see over your shoulder that you actually have an Active Directory setting that enforces that. The high assessment, high confidence assessment, however, is an audit. I mentioned we've had customers go through these for NIST 800-171. I had about 8 of them do the mediums. They sent one person for the mediums, okay? They spent days pouring through the system security plan. We were actually surprised at the level of granularity they drilled into on those system security plans. But when they did high confidence assessments, they sent 9 people. You can believe if they send 9 people to audit you, they're going to find something, right? So they're going to find stuff like, yeah, sure, you did this, but you know, you were supposed to do this every month and you only showed me you did it last month. So we're going to say that's inappropriate. We want to see that there's a pattern of you doing this thing because we say periodically. It needs to be done periodically, right? Oh, so you say that you conducted this employee training and that's great, but you didn't produce any documentation that showed every employee had signed a sheet where they attended that internal training class in the conference room, or that they sent back an email saying, yes, they watched it, and that you had a hidden Easter egg that you asked them to say they saw, and that they validated that they saw that Easter egg in the email. There's various ways you can create this documentation, and you need to do it, right? 7021 is the new subpart that introduces CMMC. It specifies the policy and the procedures for how you'll get that accreditation. In bold, they mention or exercising an option. So this 7021 is how they're going to get it onto your contract. And as they've been saying for the past year, I think this phrase means it's worse than we thought. We've been telling people for months that it only goes on brand new contracts, not on optional years. I have not had a webinar yet from respected sources where I've heard the exercising an option explained, but it seems pretty obvious to me in English that if they're exercising an optional year, they could now flow the CMMC contract onto it in the future. Maybe they only mean optional years past 2025. We need clarity there, right? There's still stuff that we need clarity on, but they've at least gone forward and driven stakes into the ground. Okay, so a little bit more information about 7019. I just want to mention that in bold, you're going to be registering your score. If you want to calculate your score, here's a URL that you can go to where there's a free calculator. There's also a link on that calculator page that explains to you how to go about creating the account that you need to create in order to log your score with the DoD. There is information, even in the interim rule, that says you can email your score. We have had clients be told once they've tried that no, they really want you to go in and register your score through using the SPRS system, which requires you to get an account on the PIEE system. So there's steps involved. Those screenshots and how you go about doing that are actually all available on that free calculator page as well. Heads up, in bold. I believe strongly, based on, I don't have access to SPRS myself, but based on the stuff I have read about from people that have, that contractors, your people upstream from you, if you're a subcontractor, that contractors and primes will now be able to look at your officially recorded score. And that score needs to be updated every 3 years. If you let it go stale after 3 years, you cannot be awarded a contract. I suggest you want to update it anytime your score improves, right? And so that's something I would definitely take a look at aggressively today. That is something you really need to get focused on. 70-20, I've described pretty much the rest of this. I'm going to leave this for you to read later. In general, this allows them to say, you know what, we're sticking with DFARS NIST on a lot of contracts for the next 3 to 5 years. And so we're going to put some higher requirements on you. Self-assessing you may not be enough. We may ask to look at all your documentation. We may send auditors on site that have access to your systems and personnel. So they're getting more aggressive and more serious about making sure that what you are required to do today, you really are doing. Okay. And then 70-21 is all about the CMMC with none of the answers. I just kind of teasingly say that. It definitely provides the structure and addresses all of the things that we've been hearing with slight variations, very slight. Unfortunately, there are some questions we still don't have answered. We hope to have more and more of that answered as the C3PAO and certified assessors are rolled out through the end of this year. Stay tuned to this space. So what should I be doing? Last slide. Implement 100% of your NIST 171 controls, the 800-171 controls, the 110 controls, right? Implement those. Start looking at your documentation problem. Today, under NIST 171, you need to have certain plans and policies. Under CMMC Maturity Level 3, you have to have documented all of the procedures that you are required to do in order to maintain your compliance. I cannot stress how heavy a lift that is for most IT departments. We have an organization that just does documentation for clients, and in terms of my internal cost, it was about $40,000 to document Centaur's procedures for our on-premise and in-cloud procedures in order to maintain our compliance. That's a heavy lift, and it's a heavier lift for most organizations, right? You may find like we do, we offer now doc sets that we help you customize for a much smaller fee than that. You may want to consider that. It's always good to edit from an example. I'm a marketing person. I write all the time. I always rather prefer to edit something someone else has written than start from a blank page. Who wouldn't, right? And at least you know if you have a set of documents, you know that you have to have that same basic set of documents, so you're not going to have a hole when you go to get your accreditation that you wish you could have avoided earlier. And then I have a few heads ups down there. The paper trail of proving that you've been doing what you've been saying you're doing on your process-oriented things, your procedure-oriented things. Hey, we had to fire a system admin. Did we follow the procedure? We had to hire a new system admin. Did we get the background check? Who did we do the background check with? Was it both a financial and a criminal background check? These are the types of things you're going to need to produce under a CMMC Maturity Level 3 accreditation. And I look forward to helping folks answer some of the questions that you may have had come up from this presentation, or possibly that I didn't answer in this presentation at all. And so we'll take a time period here. Let me catch my breath, and we'll plunge into maybe answering some questions, hopefully. Thank you.
All righty. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Chandler, for that. And as Chandler mentioned, if you do have questions, please drop them in the comments there, and we will do our best to address them. At this time, we're going to open it up to our first networking segment. So in Hopin, if you just click on the networking button, that will take you right in there, and you'll get a chance to mix and mingle with some of your fellow attendees. Hey everybody, we are back. Hopefully you had a good chance to meet other folks who are attending Defense Academy, maybe refresh your coffee and get ready for our next segment, which is coming to you again from Chandler Hall. And for this segment, he's going to be talking about FedRAMP and ATO. So with that, Chandler, take it away.
I'll be able to answer some of the questions you've got today in terms of presentation. We're going to plunge into if you've got the best application in the world out there, and everyone ought to want to have access to it, buy it, use it. How do you get the federal government? How do you get it into the federal government? What do you have to do? So we're going to plunge into what I kind of jokingly refer to. Let me get my screen active. Jokingly refer to as, oh no, a federal agency really wants our software. What now, right? So there are definitely steps that you'll need to be doing, and you really should be doing a lot of these steps now. That if you have something that you believe is designed and intended and appropriate for government users or appropriate for Department of Defense contractors and other federal contractors may want to use your specific software as well, you will find that those bring other requirements that just a commercial application do not. And those requirements are typically involve somewhat, if not mostly, governance, regulatory, compliance, cybersecurity is one aspect of that. Basically, the regulations that you're under, the steps that you have to go through in order to get your software available to be purchased and used by various different organizations in the federal government. So, what now? First off, I cannot stress in this area that knowledge and focus are just going to be key to your journey. Really, it's because there's so much out there, and it differs from agency to agency, federal organization to federal organization. What you have to do in order to get your application, your product, whether it's hardware, software, most I know in this audience are software, most are cloud, right? What do I have to do? Okay, so unfortunately, it differs, and it can differ fairly aggressive, fairly substantially from, say, a NASA to a Army to the Navy to, Coast Guard. All of those things will have slightly different variations. And even within, say, just the Army, you will find that you have different hurdles you have to overcome at one base versus another base if yours is a product that's going to be used at a particular base. You'll find that the person that you have to get your approval from, which we'll talk about, can have slightly different levels that they want you to meet at Fort Bragg instead of Fort McClellan, kind of thing, right? So it's really important to build a relationship, get to understand exactly what you have to do for that particular opportunity, and focus on that. Don't get off the beaten path by getting into just Googling and searching and wildly going around. I suggest it would be best if you're a small business to work with the Small Business Administration at the agency that you believe is your first real sales opportunity. All of us in business, if we're doing something like that, a new product, in general, it's because we know we have something. There's been an expressed desire for it. There's been an expressed interest once somebody's heard about it. And we know our real first serious opportunity. And it's that group, if that's a federal government agency, that you want to drill in on and start to really understand from their Small Business Administration point of contacts, the things you have to do to get your software accepted into that agency. So focus on that. Work with these areas. If you're not in the state of Texas, there are organizations like TPACs in every state, right? That is someone you could potentially turn to for help. If you're in the state of Texas, these links will be available in the slides that you can download from Capital Factory. Working with organizations like Capital Factory, doing something like this. The Defense Academy is a prime example of it. There are plenty of organizations out there that can help you get to where you need to be, right? And some of them are free, some of them you pay for. And, all organizations that I've worked with in these areas that I mentioned are very applicable, very experienced, and will be very helpful to you, right? So reach out and start there. Go to birds of feather gatherings. Go to various networking opportunities and network and to bring with you this, I have a question. Have you ever done this? How did you get past this? Do you know the person at so-and-so that I should be trying to speak with? Those are all great ways to not only network and meet people, but actually just to have a reason for going and to really achieve success in your company by doing so. So I'm going to give you some examples here of the regulatory compliance requirements. I want you to think about it. We're going to drill into through the rest of this presentation. We're going to talk about like an individual product. I have a cloud product. I have a cloud application that I think is great, and everybody I've shown it to in the government loves it, and I got to figure out how to get that accepted and used and sold into that. But you also, as a company, will have to meet certain compliance regulatory requirements as you are now going to be a Department of Defense contractor, where you are under, well, if you're selling to the federal government, you're under what's called Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR regulations. If you're then doing that with the Department of Defense, they have the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, or DFARS, another set of compliance standards that you have to meet in order to sell into them. So it's a bit of a challenge, but it's not impossible by any means to start understanding the various regulatory requirements that you'll be under. Manufacturing quality standards, a lot of folks have heard about ISO 9001. Okay, it gets updated every year or so. Manufacturing organizations have to go through audits, and they have to document things correctly, and they have to follow the process that they've defined in order to have that level of quality assurance that they get by being able to proudly display this ISO 9001 badge, right? Similar kind of stuff exists in various areas throughout this landscape that we're going to be talking about, right? So, you know, if you're going to be doing things that require clearances, well, then you've got some facility and personnel privacy and security things you have to do. Maybe you have to improve, literally build a room in your building that reduces the ability for eavesdropping and other things, because classified information may be contained inside that room. Systems can and cannot go in and out of that. Right? No cell phones, things of that nature, right? The Department of Defense information controls, things like ITAR, DFARS 252.204-7012, I've mentioned earlier. We shorten that a lot of times to DFARS 7012. The NIST SP 800-171 set of cybersecurity controls that you need to have implemented and be doing every single day. That's another major requirement. I'll shorten that to NIST 171. And the upcoming Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification is another more daunting standard that you have to meet going forward, where you'll actually have companies like Centaur audit you, in essence, for your compliance to those levels of requirement as well. We have actually got another session at the Capitol Factory under the Defense Academy that you can get more information on the CMMC. I've actually done that presentation, and I would recommend taking a look at that if you're new to the space. And then finally, in red, because red to me means danger, FedRAMP, the requirement to actually have your application get FedRAMP accreditation. This is a heavy lift. I will not be able to stress enough how much time and cost will be involved in you obtaining that. But as you do that, you get into an area where more and more federal agencies can more easily, quickly adopt and allow your application to be used. And of course, it's quite of a moat to eliminate competition as well. So there is that advantage to going through that level of work. But even if you do those things, the last bullet is really the final, where the rubber meets the road. Have you obtained your authority to operate? So this is something that's not new and has been out there for, I don't know, decades, definitely years, amounting to at least a decade, I think, where I have this wonderful single application. And I have this small group of Army personnel here at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, that just, it's all they need to get their job done better. And I happen to, you know, be friends with one of them, and I talk about what we've done, and they're like, oh, I'm really interested in that. In the old days, I would literally give them my application, and they would scan it. They'd put it on in a closed environment. They'd look and see what was going on. They would do all sorts of things to essentially monitor and investigate, kind of like a malware type thing, right? to make sure that it's doing only what it's supposed to be doing and not any other insidious thing like a Trojan horse built into the software, before they would then give us an authority to operate. And really, in those days, you had an authority to connect, meaning you first had to go through the approval that I discussed to allow you to even just connect to their network. And then there might be other regulations that you have to go through in order to allow it to operate on the network and going forward. Most of that today is really just considered an authority to operate, though we'll call out some of the special areas in that as well. If you're doing things where you're actually, it'll be government employees using their equipment and your stuff will be on that equipment, then you'll probably have to meet a much higher standard, NIST standard, than 800-171, which has about 110 controls in it. You'll probably have to address NIST 853. That has 1,400 controls on it, approximately, somewhere around there, 1,200 to 1,500. Some of them you don't have to do, some of them you have to do depending on the organization you're in and the environment you're in. That standard is the Bible that the overall risk management framework process utilizes to do the necessary analysis and documentation to make sure that your ATO is sufficiently secured and safe for our various armed forces and other federal agencies to allow your product to be installed in their systems and running in their areas, right? So those are areas where all of those, if you literally have a cloud application that you expect the federal government to utilize, their employees to utilize, you're probably going to have to deal with every single thing on this page. All right. So examples of DoD regulatory compliance requirements for federal systems that are a little different from the contractor systems. But I'm going to talk in some ways just about the structure of the laws and you know what drives you to do certain things. So FSMA is the law, if you would, that requires compliance with various standards. So as a contractor, you're going to have a law written into your DoD contractor as an example, which is called DFARS 252.204. So that law says there are things you have to do to meet this regulation. And one of those things is you must implement a bunch of cybersecurity controls under the standard NIST 800-171. In that same fashion, FSMA was created to enforce standards adherence throughout all the government, okay? And then they came out, so that's, FSMA's been out a while, obviously. 853's been out for years. I think they're currently on standard 5, I think was just released, version 5. Risk management framework has probably been around more than 10 years now, possibly 14 if I look back on it. The new standard on the block is FedRAMP. All right, so cloud applications didn't exist 5 years ago, so they didn't have a needed standard for it. But boy, that thing has accelerated. Cloud applications, the benefit of using the cloud, the benefit of having centralized storage and control and other stuff of that nature, anonymized data, big data, all of these kind of things really come from cloud application deployment and massive cloud application use. So there are a lot of benefits we've learned over the past few years that really actually come to be in reality just because of the volume of users and data that can now be analyzed and collected and utilized to bring actionable information and actionable data to the end users, right? So cloud applications are huge. They're not going away. Government recognized that. The government adopted a philosophy of we will go to the cloud wherever possible, okay? And to do that, they needed a way to maybe open up the ecosystem to more and more software providers while locking down the compliance and the security of those applications. So they looked at the old ATO process where it was islands all over the Department of Defense, all over the rest of the federal government. You had islands. You had a good person over at Fort McClellan that absolutely understood some of the Trojan horse issues and other kind of things, and they would maybe make vendors that were going for their authority to operate go through more scanning and do code reviews and maybe even allow them to look at the software themselves, to look at sections and make sure they felt comfortable having it running, all right? Today, that is addressed for cloud application developers with the FedRAMP standard. So we're going to drill into FedRAMP more in the rest of this presentation as well, okay? I am going to touch base on a few of these other things before we get into that. ITAR, FCI, and CUI. For those of you that have watched the CMMC presentations that I've done, you'll understand that there's a new type of name for this data that we've had to deal with for years. And that data, that name is CUI, for controlled unclassified information. It's not the classified secret and top secret level stuff. It's data that sits just underneath it. But I'll tell you some of the stuff that in our business, when the DFARS 7012 rule came along years ago, and I would have various contractors and other types of companies contact me to go, we're staring at this new rule. We don't even know what this CUI stuff is. Do we even have CUI? And unfortunately, the government, what they looked at in 2010 was like, we got a real problem here. Chinese are stealing us blind. Okay, pure and simple. Stealing all sorts of technology from us, billions a year. Okay, got the F-35 plane built a month after we had it built. How'd they do that, right? A lot of how they did that was attacking the contractors and getting one puzzle piece of technology here and two other puzzle pieces over there and putting the puzzle pieces together in China, right? And we decided we had to stop that. Part of the confusion where contractors shouldn't be blamed was what we would all kind of typically as lay people do, blame the government over too much regulation, too much stuff. Yes, here's what they had. They had too many names. They had too many different, slightly different things that you had to handle differently, had different, slightly different rules, whether it was for official use only or ITAR export restriction or other types of acronyms that designated types of data that the government wanted you to protect. Too confusing. So first off, they lumped all that together, gave it a surname like we have a last name, right? CUI, okay? And then they still maintained or kept a lot of the acronyms people are comfortable with, like ITAR. So ITAR, it's not classified information, but it's restricted. So it's controlled, but unclassified information. So ITAR is CUI, big umbrella, and the first name of CUI for ITAR will be ITAR, right? So we're gonna have CUI ITAR and CUI FOUO and other types of CUI with this slightly very changed name in terms of how we reference them, but that's allowed them to more efficiently create models, standards. Let's see, there's actually a CUI registry out there, which is a database that helps you understand whether you have CUI or you don't. So a couple of examples of this, right? I had the carrier air conditioning franchise in Hawaii contact me. A sales engineer was given the job by the boss. Hey, figure out what we got to do about this DFAR stuff. And so I'm a little worried about it, right? We sell air conditioning compressors to Navy bases all day long. We sure don't want to lose that business. So this lady called me. And I'm thinking to myself, like, wow, that does seem a little stretch. You know, first of all, I was thinking, wow, I've got the Hawaii franchise calling me. I wish it was the corporate office calling me, because that would be so big business, right? All the franchises. And so I started kind of drilling into it and like, well, what do you do? Do you have some unique air conditioning unit that you sell into the Department of Defense? I mean, is it the same one you sell to Pizza Hut down the road? And she tells me, no, they don't have anything different. There's nothing unique about the AC compressor or whatever. Same one they'd sell at Pizza Hut. So that one was a puzzler, right? So I had learned at this point through my subject matter experts that do all the operations and the real work. I'm just a pretty face, right? The biz dev guy, the cyber evangelist. So I'd learned at that point that I needed to drill further, right? So I said, well, how do you get your business? Okay, what do you do to do this? And after a short conversation, I learned that if they need a new air conditioning unit at a Navy building in Hawaii, the folks at that building, the facilities security officer, sends them an HVAC plan so that they can properly size the air conditioning unit. So I'm like, oh, like Bruce Willis in Die Hard, you're getting that information. They're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, there's your CUI, right? I have surveyors and ditch digging organizations that have contacted us because they install golf course irrigation systems on Army bases. Whoops, guess what? They're sometimes given GPS coordinates with notations of what's in the ground, like here's our main water pipe that sends water to all of our personnel. Well, that's probably CUI, right? And so, you know, part of what we do with this is to help them address ways to say, well, maybe we can not get that information, and then therefore you're not under these regulations. Or maybe if instead of naming all your video files and all the data you create as the GPS coordinates on the base, maybe we can come up with some mapping scheme where we protect that what would be CUI in a more enclave, isolated area where we can reduce the impact of your company, and all your surveyors out in the field don't have to be worried about what data they're holding and carrying around, where they have to like lock it up and do other stuff like that, right? So that becomes important. As we move forward through time, they first created this thing called CUI, and they created a regulation called DFARS 252.204/7012, and they created a standard called NIST 800-171, and then they kind of took their foot off the gas pedal and allowed contractors to not do all the work, to not finish the job, but just to document the problem children on a spreadsheet and get to it when it's practical, right? And they recognized after the past couple of years that that wasn't very, very safe. They had another problem is that companies that were in essence cutting corners were lower priced because their costs were not as high, and they were winning the business, and they were the last person that you'd want to give the business to compared to the ones that did the work correctly and are more cyber secure. And so they've created a new thing that we're going to all now have to run toward, which is a formal CMMC accreditation. We'll touch briefly on that, but really there's other presentations that you can access that will give you the detailed information you need for that. But the reason I bring it up now is the break between the old DFARS and NIST 171 model to the new DFARS CMMC model was a recognition that they were asking all 285,000 DoD contractors to meet the same metric, even if all they did was sell the same carrier air conditioning unit to the Navy, or like in my town, they're a disabled veteran shop that literally sews U.S. flags for sale to the DoD to put on their Navy ships, right? They don't need the same level of cybersecurity as someone who has access to the HVAC plans of a DoD building, or potentially, is that Mike Pence's flaw? Potentially, you might have other types of data. And so if you're making Army boots and you're selling various non-super critical, those are critical aspects, but you're receiving data from your federal agency, which you critically have to defend and to control. So the communications back and forth between contractors are still important data. This is the FCI data. So as an example, see if I can come up with a one that's not so gruesome as one I have in my head, but I can't. So I'm going to just go with this one. So my flag vendor, right? Is it possible that the Department of Defense has a surge order for flags when they believe they're about to go to war? Well, they might. Right? So just the email communication back and forth between the Navy purchasing officer and the folks that are sewing flags with a heads up that we want you to triple our order this next quarter and keep that run rate going for a year could be a real tell that you wouldn't want out. So that data, while there wasn't any special information that went back and forth, it's important federal contractor information, communications that they want you to protect. And so that sets the bar for even that small of a level of information is going to require CMMC level 1. But if you're not receiving missile data, like I have one company in Texas that makes foam for shipping containers, right? You've gotten these really nice products where the cutout of the foam fits exactly the product you're pulling out. And it's such a nice out-of-box experience, right? And things like that. So they call me and they're like, I can't believe I have to do this DFARS thing. All this NIST stuff. Why would I have to do that? Well, I've already gotten a little more versed at my job at that point. And I'm like, so what are these shapes you're cutting out? What are you shipping in these containers? Oh, they're missiles. I'm like, oh, from Missile Defense Agency, the shape of a missile, okay? And is there like, if I were to get that part number of that shipping container and drill into your systems, could I find out the maximum weight capability maybe and possibly the shipping address? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, well, there you go, right? There's your coup. So you can tend to, if you really kind of step back and think about being the hacker type, the role play, what's my way in? How can I get this? If this is too hard, I go that direction. Can I get it easier? Right? That's a great way for you to think about this information maybe receiving that you need to protect. Okay. So as I've obviously pointed out on a few of these past slides, you've got various governance compliance regulations that you've got to meet. All of them require this DFARS contract I've mentioned if you're a DoD contractor. It currently requires NIST 171. It's going to continue requiring NIST 171. Matter of fact, they've recently strengthened the teeth of that. They're going to allow themselves, government DCMA may show up on site and actually audit you for your NIST 171 compliance. I've had about a dozen customers that have gotten that kind of an audit. And so there's more and more. This is growing. This is not going to go away. So it's better to get on the forefront of this and keep addressed and keep up to date on these as they roll out, because your annual impact is a much smaller impact to your corporate budget and your training effort and your impact to your workflow of business if you're only having to do the next new thing instead of all of a sudden going, wow, I sat around and didn't do these 110 NIST 171 controls. Now I got to do ML3 and I got to do 20 more, and I've got to actually be audited by a C3PAO independent company. It seems daunting, and it is, and it can be, right? So start taking these one bite at a time and get through them all, right? The CMMC accreditation I mentioned, that will be the next big bogey. It will not hit that many companies between now and this time next year, say fall of 2021, but between fall of 2021 and fall of 2022, it'll hit about 8,000 contractors at that point, and it'll ramp up every year after that until every contract coming out of the Department of Defense by the end of September 30th, 2025 will have the CMMC formal accreditation requirement, where you will have to get accredited and you will have to maintain and get reaccredited every 3 years on that. So all of that stuff, right? The one thing that those regulations do that are overlap into FedRAMP is, and this is important, if, like I have some clients like this, that you're out there, you're developing a great cloud application, the biggest volume of your sales opportunity, your market, might be DoD contractors or other federal contractors. Maybe you have a great tie-in between, say, Deltek's accounting system and better project management software, and you think that 70% of all the contractors that are Deltek customers are going to want to buy your product as an additive additional product, right? So now you fall into this one thing that DFARS requires is if you have a cloud application and Department of Defense contractors are going to use it, then your application will have to at least meet the FedRAMP moderate equivalent security level out there. So there's an area where FedRAMP, which is a standard created to apply to cloud applications that the government is using, they've now taken that and pushed it one step further out and said, well, certain federal contractors, DoD contractors, also, if they're using cloud applications that are containing unencrypted CUI, like we talked about, HVAC drawings maybe. If they're doing that, then those cloud applications have to meet the same requirement that we make them meet for our own employees in the government. So FedRAMP moderate is kind of a bogey that whether you're focusing on the government or focusing on government contractors, you need to be very aware of, and you need to be aggressively working toward getting that accreditation. I'm going to take a little bit of a detour in terms of just talking ATO and all those standards and now drill into FedRAMP itself, okay? So I mentioned earlier that the FISMA, Federal Information Security Act, is the law, okay? FedRAMP is the standard that FISMA has been modified to, in essence, enforce or bring into that umbrella, right? So it's a government-wide cloud security program. That sounds ugly. It seems difficult. Why don't I have yet another one of these things to do? Remember the islands of different hurdles that you would have to meet if you try to sell this throughout the federal government? FedRAMP helps you on that area. So once you've had one agency sponsor you and you've obtained your FedRAMP accreditation, that's now listed at the FedRAMP.gov marketplace, and it is far, far easier, quicker, and less costly to you to get the next federal agency to allow it to be used, purchased and used in their agency. So once you've done this once, it's easily replicable and is a lot less daunting and costly of an effort to get a different federal agency. So there's your benefit, right? If you actually have a project management application in the cloud that you think state and local governments, federal governments, whether they're Homeland Security or whether Department of Interior or Department of Justice or the Department of Defense, it's easier for you to now get that accepted and utilized to get your authority to operate in all of those agencies, far less of a hurdle once you've done the first one, okay? And that's the big difference between the old days of having to meet that particular individual sets of requirements, which are based on a subset of standards, right? But they all had slightly different things too, right? Someone they were, smarter, they knew better, they had a thing that burned them once. not going to be burned again, right? So they could define everything that they wanted to be done, and you basically had to jump to that tune no matter what you thought was appropriate or not, right? Or you walked away and sold to somebody else, okay? FedRAMP solves that problem for you. So that's good news, right? So I'm going to stop for a moment. So I've kind of talked about why FedRAMP's good, how it gets brought in as a law. I definitely think that as you explore your FedRAMP requirements and how to easily meet those requirements, to recognize that it's probably not going to be easy. You need to be really understanding this rather than just kind of letting your eyes gloss over as you read this. Do I have to do that, right? So do more than just kind of read the standard and go, I wonder how bad this is, right? Getting your cloud application FedRAMP accredited is difficult, expensive, and can consume a lot of your company's resources and time. I'm just going to rip that Band-Aid right off, right? There's things that are happening. There are things that have been happening for the past year or so at various brand organizations and platforms, Amazon AWS, Microsoft Azure. There's various things that they're doing to try to make it more efficient, make it quicker, reduce the amount of time required to get your authority to operate, right? And that's great. But they're point solutions at this point. Might be appropriate for your application, not going to be appropriate for the next one. Might help you do just the documentation part, doesn't help you figure out what you're doing wrong in the actual programming. What do you have to change? What could I use instead? If this is telling me that's not cutting it, what would cut it? How do I find that out, right? So there are now groups of people at Amazon, groups of people at Microsoft, groups of people at other areas, Salesforce, et cetera, that will help you address that. All of the massive, large, popular cloud applications, Microsoft 365, that's a cloud application. Google G Suite, Gmail, us lay people think of it in our personal account lives. They've gone and got their FedRAMP accreditation. Microsoft's gotten theirs. Salesforce has gotten theirs. They oftentimes, however, have different flavor, a different version of their application that is compliant with that standard. So heads up, you need to understand, did you buy the right thing? If I didn't, what does it take me to get to the right thing? Those are always probably something that you really want to drill into and start to peel this onion apart, right? I would say that if the words FedRAMP are new to you, you need to assume it's going to take you a year to get FedRAMP accreditation. And to be frank, it's going to be very difficult if you are not involved with an agency that really likes what you have, because you need an agency to sponsor your FedRAMP accreditation. All right. So that is a relationship you need to build. That is a biz dev thing that you need to be working on. You need to be enticing them to want to assign a resource to you that will sponsor you through that journey. All right. And again, I'll reiterate in red, if you're using a cloud application that contains unencrypted CUI, your application must be FedRAMP moderate equivalent, the application you're using. And I use that word equivalent because that's the law. That means they don't actually have to be listed on the FedRAMP government marketplace. But if you have a vendor telling you that they're equivalent to FedRAMP, I would really, really push hard to get all the documentation you can get from them so that you are comfortable that they really have done their work, because you're basically relying on their word that they've done so. And I would try to avoid that wherever possible. So don't be fooled. You're going to be fooled. I've had clients get fooled, right? If it sounds easy, you've been fooled. There's pure and simple in this space. This is hard, okay? So what you're going to find is I can't tell you the dozens and dozens of clients that came to me to say, well, I'm being told by my government person or my biz dev person that I've got to go get FedRAMP moderate accreditation, but I run on Amazon AWS, and if you go to the FedRAMP marketplace at fedramp.gov, you can see Amazon AWS is accredited at FedRAMP moderate. I'm good. No, you're not. Okay. All that's saying is that you have chosen a platform, whether it's Microsoft Azure, whether it's Amazon AWS, Microsoft would be GCC High. Okay. So if you've purchased licenses to use Microsoft 365 as your email and file sharing, and you are not on GCC High, then you're not where you need to be as a client, as a cloud application meeting the standard. If you're going to be shipping CUI back and forth in email, you need to migrate your stuff over to GCC High and pay a bigger check to Microsoft, because the work that they do and to maintain these data centers where they are on U.S. soil using only U.S. citizens, and are stringently scanning and investigating and researching and analyzing and documenting everything they have to do to meet that much higher level of standard is a cost that they pass on to you through their licensing. Okay, so it's not good enough to just have your application or be using a third-party application that is hosted at Amazon AWS or Microsoft Azure. It must be FedRAMP moderate, equivalent, and probably accredited before I would be comfortable with that. Okay, so recognize that that's an area where many people stumble, and you just shouldn't be. So let's take an example. Okay, so when I was trying to figure out who the audience would be here, I decided that I would go a little step below FedRAMP cloud application and just say maybe you have a software application and that you've got a phase 2 Navy SIBR that's going to have CUI flow down to your company in order for you to develop that and enhance it the way your Navy contact is excited to get your application doing that, right? So they've ordered you some money to modify, come up with a prototype. Maybe it's phase 2, so you've done your prototype, you convinced them you can do it. Now they're throwing more money at you to build that up. And the goal you're wanting to get to is at the end of this phase 2 contract, you want it to be ready to be purchased in volume under a phase 3 commercialization SIBR contract to everyone in that Navy organization. So what all do you have to do during your phase 2 so that when you spend your money wisely, so that when you're done with phase 2, you're ready to really sell in volume? Okay. Well, so first off, your company itself has requirements. You got to be DFARS 7012 compliant. Now you're going to have to be DFARS 7019, 7020, and 7021. The 3 new subparts, the 3 new clauses to DFARS 252.204. You're going to have to meet all of those at November the 30th, 2020. So new things to do, right? You got to be NIST 171 compliant. You need to have all of your NIST 171 stuff implemented. When I first did this slide, you could still get away with not having all of it implemented. But with CMMC maturity level 3 coming at you like a train, you better get them all implemented, right? It's just insane not to do that, okay? You got to be using cloud applications that are storing, processing, or transmitting unencrypted CUI that meet the FedRAMP moderate standard. Otherwise, you aren't meeting what you have to meet as a company, right? So even though you're focused on your application, you're using other applications, you got to worry about those now, right? You should be at least a CMMI maturity level 1, I would suggest, which is a software development process that says you have a certain level of quality that you're maintaining, and you follow these processes and you document these processes. Very similar to ISO 9001, but for software developers. Really, I would hope to think that you're actually at maturity level 3, which is all your projects that you develop follow the same process. If you're doing it for one, you should be able to do it for all, right? And that's a better standard to meet, and you'll get more business from the federal government if you're actually at a CMMI level of 3. You might also have to be doing code reviews. I would suggest that you absolutely start doing code reviews or looking at the problem of how you're going to do code reviews to meet the new CMMC requirement that says you're reviewing your code that you're developing for your own internal use, obviously, as well as for the government to use, that you're meeting a certain compliance level with that by at least doing code reviews. So in the old days, we would have said you had to have a firewall, different development team, look at the code. They didn't do any of the development, but they need to look at the code for vulnerabilities. Things like you divide by 0, and that could get it to cause or an SQL injection. You haven't really bounded your variables correctly. Those types of things that they can do. Here's my only sales plug. Centaur does actually have a product that we developed to meet those requirements of scanning for vulnerabilities in secure SCIF environments for the Missile Defense Agency. We call that Code Valor. So if you're looking for a product that has to deal with, excuse me, classified information, can't be a cloud code scanner because you can't attach that environment to the internet, right? So you need a different type of product. We have one of those we've developed for that, and it's a great one to use even if you're not in that environment to hit these checkbox requirements that are coming at you in CMMC level 3. But you don't have to have a product. You can use the labor force, right, and do firewall development teams. Maybe you have 2 different teams. One does one does the other. They review each other's. Look at the problem, look at the requirement, maybe talk to a company like Centaur if you're not sure. Develop what you're going to have in place now so that you're doing that level of work that'll meet that more easily, all right? And then finally, your biz dev folks ought to be in the streets working with that federal agency, the person that you think is best going to want your stuff, to see if they will sponsor you on your access-only ATO requirements. So some people, you will need to be sponsored, and to receive your on base in that environment, that specific agency, you'll have to get an ATO from them. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of how that goes. Okay, I mentioned early in this presentation the authority to connect. That isn't something that happens that often as much anymore. A lot of software applications are just ATOs. But if what you were doing was, say, some type of appliance where you have software embedded in this device that now needs to be installed in the government facility, well, you're going to first have to get an authority to connect and then obtain your authority to operate, right? So that's yet another little hurdle that you've got to do. In general, obtaining an ATC isn't always required to obtain the ATO. As I mentioned, it's a lot of times that's for software, right? Only, right? And so really where that rubber meets the road, as I mentioned earlier, is I've gone through my effort of making sure my company hits all of these compliance requirements. I've gone through the effort of making sure I've got all the standards and the processes in place that I need to have in place. And now I'm taking my finished thing into this federal agency, and I need to get my authority to operate. Okay, so your authority to operate is a FSMA, again, a FSMA awarded thing. You'll work with that specific agency. If it is a cloud application and you're doing FedRAMP, again, I'll reiterate that the beauty there is you're only going to have you're still going to have to get an ATO from every agency. But the types of things that you have to do, the majority of it you'll have already done. The documentation will be pristine, and there is a level of responsibility now placed on these different ATO authorities that they have to accept as much as possible all of the FedRAMP required effort, and to try to have the only unique ATO stuff that they absolutely need to have above and beyond FedRAMP, right? So, you know, if you're a CSP, I've mentioned this already, but you need to work with an agency. Who will sponsor me to get my FedRAMP accreditation? It is difficult to get a FedRAMP accreditation. It's really impossible to get a FedRAMP accreditation if you don't get an authority, if you don't get an agency who will sponsor you. You can go ahead and start the effort with the belief and the expectation that you'll win over an agency to sponsor you. But you could do this year-long effort, get your product all ready, get to the end of that, and have difficulty finding an agency who will sponsor you, because it is a resource impact to the agency to do that. That is being addressed, and that is being made better as we roll forward, but it is still a challenge today. And what is acceptable to one agency is maybe not to the other, but at least in the FedRAMP space, you can leverage a lot of the very heavy, difficult lift that you're involved with, right? So what can you do today? What do you do now, right? So review your contracts. Look for clauses like that defarce clause. Look for clauses that pull in. It won't be in your contract. This is almost a puzzle game, right? You say, what's that defarce requirement? Oh, wait, okay. In the defarce requirement, it does say something about cloud applications and FedRAMP. Now I better go look at the FedRAMP standard and see what that means, right? So you can drill in, start first with your contracts folks. Contact a company like Centaur, the GRC company. Probably could cut that research time to a minimal amount, because, you know, we tend to deal with those type of customers more often than you've dealt with the problem, probably, right? Make sure that your developers today are aware of these standards, these requirements. If they don't understand them, figure out ways that you can get them to understand. There's a lot of wonderful FedRAMP videos that have been getting rolled out by the FedRAMP Program Management Office. Have them watch those, okay? If they can start designing in the things they need. Remember I mentioned that at least over, I think, on Amazon AWS, there's a program they call ATO on AWS. And in that, it's a collection of vendors who have tried to create products or integrate with other things at Amazon AWS to help accelerate or compress that time required to get your ATO. One of those is, help me get this documentation. It's a massive lift. Do I have anything that can help me do that? So some products will actually maybe scan all of your APIs and pull out from those APIs. If they know you're calling this Amazon core module, this, you know, routine in your software, Amazon's already got that documented for FedRAMP. So now that I know your API called it, this program will tell you what document you need to go get and store in your repository package that you're going to submit to the FedRAMP Program Management Office via a 3PAO. Something Centaur is a third-party accreditation organization. It's a FedRAMP approved standard. Don't confuse that with the CMMC accredited requirement, which is C3PAO. They basically stole the 3PAO part, put CMMC in front of it, right? So, so you work with the FedRAMP 3PAO to get your FedRAMP accreditation. They're the people that show up and penetrate test your application, review all of your documentation, and essentially audit you under a weeks-long process as to whether they will recommend to the FedRAMP Program Management Office that you do be awarded a FedRAMP accreditation. So work with your developers to understand those requirements, have them start investigating things they're doing. I'm going to be frank, if you just in the early infancy design of your product, it would behoove you to contact some 3PAO consulting organization, because you could pick different pieces of your stack and significantly reduce this part of the effort that you may not be aware of is extremely costly and time consuming. So it's worthwhile reaching out early in the design cycles to figure out if you're going down the right path and picking the right pieces of your stack, if there are better choices that you could be making. There are a lot of companies that design a product and then end up ripping the entire stack apart and using other pieces and having to go through all the recertification, re-debugging, and you know, all that kind of stuff just because they picked badly at the beginning, right? And gosh, in the cloud space, I think it seems to be a religion between DevOps as to pieces of the stack and which one you should be using and why, right? They spend more time on that than they do actually coding the environment, it looks like. So really critical that you get involved in that from a management standpoint and understand the bigger picture and some of the stuff that maybe they don't actually recognize are a real challenge, right? And then finally, the most important thing you could do is build a strong relationship with your agency contacts. Understand what their ATO requirements are and stay focused on that bogey. You're going to learn the most. You're going to get some sales out of it, and then you're going to leverage and branch out from there. And the easiest, best way to do that is to have a strong relationship with the folks at the agency side that you'll be using to get your authority to operate. And ask them if they'll sponsor you your FedRAMP accreditation if that's something you're going to be doing. So I hope that helps you figure out what to do and get started. I'd like to take some time to, again, thank Capital Factory, and I'd like to thank everybody for your time today. And look forward to addressing any questions that you still have remaining. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Well, thanks again to Chandler for sharing with us all of that great information about FedRAMP and ATO. And thank you all for joining us. We are cruising right along here today. We have another really awesome presentation coming your way before we wrap up for today. Just a reminder, this is the second of 3 days, so there's lots of really great programming that's going to be happening tomorrow starting at 11 a.m. Central Time. So we hope to see you here following today's program. And so with that, really, really excited to bring to the stage Heather Richman, who is the entrepreneur in residence at BMNT, founder of the Defense Investor Network. And she's joining us today from Palo Alto, California. So Heather, welcome to the stage.
Sean, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you back.
All right, everybody out there. I'm like Sean said, I'm coming from at you from Palo Alto, California, where I work a lot here, kind of at that intersection of private investment, private capital, and the Department of Defense and intelligence communities. And so, as we've been here and experiencing, frankly, a lot of events in the last couple of years, the impact of foreign direct investment and CFIUS and trusted capital are all things that I spend my everyday on. So I just wanted to, I really appreciate actually the Capital Factory and Sean and Justin and Rebecca for spending some time on this topic. I think it's a really important topic. And I think it's one that every time I speak to a group of entrepreneurs, a lot of them say they didn't know about this and really appreciate the information, but here to be a resource, here to answer questions. And I'm going to put my slides in present mode as I'm being asked to do. And there we go. Okay. I actually can't see myself or the chat when I'm in present mode, so I'm just going to go for it, and then I will take myself out of present mode. But if you have some questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. So I just want to start with, I'm terrible at making PowerPoint presentations, and so go with me on that one. I think the #1 rule is add pictures, not words, and it's all words. So the goal of this really is to provide you with very specific, actionable information, points of contact, emails, that sort of thing, and really give you a sense of kind of what's going on in the private capital space right now as it pertains to national security, and hopefully answer some of your questions. I'm also a painfully candid person, and so I've been working with the team and with various teams on this topic again for about 2 years. And in true entrepreneurial form. Some things work the first time, some things don't work until the third or fourth time. So I'm happy to share a little bit of inside baseball, tell you a little bit about how the sausage has been made, and really give you the current status of the Trusted Capital Marketplace and other initiatives that are happening right now. They're all still very much in build mode. And so, there's going to be some frustrations along the way as you try to engage with them. So just to be totally transparent on that. So first of all, we're calling it keeping it clean. Where your funding comes from is a matter of national security. My name's Heather. That's some of the things that I do, and happy to be here. So let's start with CFIUS. CFIUS is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. Very specifically, it's led by Treasury. So CFIUS is an interagency committee authorized to review certain transactions involving foreign investment. We'll call it foreign direct investment, FDI, in the United States and certain real estate transactions. So basically, it's this idea of where is your money coming from? We're going to get to actually the countries of special concern later in the presentation. We'll get very specific, but it's actually led by the Treasury Department. Tom Fetto is a great guy. He's the Assistant Secretary at Treasury for Investment Security. And so each agency then has a CFIUS lead. Within the DoD, the CFIUS work or the CFIUS team is housed under Undersecretary Ellen Lord. She's the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment. She is a political appointee, so come January 20th, we don't know if she'll still be there. But whoever's in that role as the Undersecretary for A&S will still be responsible for the CFIUS portfolio. The DoD CFIUS lead is Andrew Petusky, awesome guy, great technical knowledge. Happy to help put you guys in touch if you have questions. And then the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Industrial Policy, which is then the DASD right above CFIUS, is Jeb Nadner. So basically, the CFIUS and the whole process of foreign direct investment and figuring out where capital is coming from is really critical to the defense industrial base. The Industrial Policy Office, which is again under that Undersecretary's office, really holds that Trusted Capital Marketplace. And it's an online platform that fosters deal flow in the interest of national security. So here's a little bit of the inside baseball, I guess, about January 2019, so just 2 years ago. This kind of concept came about where there was a lot of attention being paid to the fact that between about 2014 and 2018, about $10 billion of Chinese capital came into Silicon Valley. There's about another $10 billion that came into other parts of the country as well. So in a 4-year period, it's about $20 billion of unanswered capital, and that's just from China. So like I said, we'll get to the countries of concern. There's about 37 of them, I believe. There's exactly 37 of them. But there's kind of a big four, which are China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. So when I say China, I kind of mean all of them. But as of right now, the biggest focus is on China. And so that capital has been coming in. Obviously, that capital has been going into venture capital funds. Those funds are then investing that capital into companies. One challenge is that a lot of times the LPs, so an LP is a limited partner. So a limited partner would be the Chinese entity, a Chinese family, the CCP, putting money into a fund. And the challenge is that a lot of times funds don't disclose or are not open about who their LPs are. And so you as a CEO who's raising capital may take money from, say, Kleiner Perkins and not realize that they have Chinese capital in their fund. And so I know it's been a very touchy subject in the past, and I've been an entrepreneur and I've raised a lot of money. And I know that when you're having a conversation with an investor, the last thing you want to do is offend them. And so it's a tricky thing to ask, and it's a tricky thing to figure out. And so I'll get further along in the talk. I'll let you know kind of some steps that are being taken, some ways that hopefully we can help you with that. Trusted Capital brings corporate suppliers that are critical to the defense industrial base. So if we call you kind of the supplier or the capability provider, that's another word for a startup, for a company. And bring those together with trusted capital providers. And so basically, the word trusted is used a lot here, and we'll get more into it with the trusted capital marketplace conversation. But really the idea is bringing some transparency around a company, where your funding comes from, who your team is. And then basically the third check mark is, are you national security critical? But I think a lot of the bigger challenges right now are happening on the investor side due to that lack of transparency that I mentioned. And so I'm working very diligently. Part of the reason the reason I started something called the Defense Investor Network was started back in June 2019 to bring together investors who are very willing to be transparent about where their money comes from. And they understand how critical the national security piece is and are willing to very openly say, we'll call it nefarious capital, or we don't have capital from sources that are trying to steal our IP, steal our technology, steal even our talent. So basically what is happening with Trusted Capital is the original idea was to build, Ms. Lords called it a dating app, or kind of an online platform where investors will, upload their information and then be vetted, and to make sure that they don't have nefarious capital, that it's clean. And then companies would also upload their information and be vetted. There's been some challenges with that. One, as I promised, I would tell you a little bit about how things are going, where things started and how they're going. And it's difficult to get investors to voluntarily sign up for something like that and to go through the vetting process. It's a pretty stringent process. It asks a lot of very personal questions, both about the investor themselves, as well as their LPs, as well as their fund, their investing track record, and the like. And so part of what we're trying to do is actually educate the investor base about, obviously, the importance of this. We're going through a very interesting time in our country's history right now. And I think the face of war and how we're having to think about it and look at it is very, very different. And so this investment component is really critical. And I'll get more into that. Again, more words, sorry. But the Trusted Capital Marketplace Initiative is the DoD-led but whole of government program supporting trusted partnerships between critical capability providers. There should be an R in there, sorry, and capital providers or investors. I'll let you read that. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it really is this idea of how do we provide, companies that are raising money and providing critical capabilities, all the tools, and frankly, truly the resources and the dollars to get the work done that you need to get done. And so I'll kind of skip down to the bottom there, and it talks about employ strategic capital in the form of loans, loan guarantees, incentives, and investments to increase the capability of the defense industrial base to support DoD production needs. So part of, I think, what I want to make sure everyone's really aware of and is thinking about is there's the Trusted Capital Marketplace, or TCM. I typically cut off the word marketplace and just talk about this concept of trusted capital. And this is part of this. As I told you, a lot of this is still being developed and being being figured out, frankly. And so this idea, I want you guys to think about it more as a trusted capital concept. So this idea that we've got things like DFC, which is it's what OPEC used to be, and it's actually basically a bank within the government. DoD has an agreement with DFC, which is the International. I'm forgetting what IDFC stands for. DFC, I'll look it up. But basically, they've got an agreement with DoD around what's called DPA, which is the Defense Production Act Title III. That DPA Title III allows certain dollars to be spent in certain ways when basically industry isn't getting it done. And I hate to say it that way, but a lot of times there's, when you're talking about market dynamics, there's a bit of a chicken and egg or a cart and a horse. And so sometimes DPA Title III dollars can be used to kind of further that along. One really good example was about 10 years ago, Navy was working on something called the Great Green Fleet, and they were looking at biofuel production, and they were trying to clean up, the fuels that they were using in their ships and in their planes. The challenge was you had a lot of early stage feedstock providers that were very small, and then you had the large oil refineries and the large oil companies who weren't willing to really go in and take the risk and sign an offtake agreement with a very small feedstock provider. The challenge was, this is a little bit of chicken and egg there. The challenge was the military really wanted this fuel. They couldn't get industry to kind of get over that hump there. And so actually it was Navy Fuels, that they have a division called Navy Fuels, and the Department of Agriculture came together and actually used DPA Title III authorities and dollars to help fix that. And so that's just one example. There's a lot of that going on, but basically back to my point about the loans and the loan guarantees, there is inexpensive capital, we'll call it, or debt capital through DFC that has been authorized through DPA authorities by the Department of Defense. Sorry for all the acronyms, and happy to go in a little bit more about that with some questions. But if you have a clean cap table and a clean team and you're national security critical, they're actually asking me and other folks to help find some of these companies, because they've had a number of companies come who don't have clean cap tables, and we can talk a little bit about that as well, and how we can maybe help you fix that. So major risk from adversarial capital to innovation and supply chain integrity. So Trusted Capital is working to maximize this public-private partnership model. Really, it's how are we going to figure out where nefarious capital is inside of various companies? But more importantly, and I'm hoping the message you guys get today is we'd like to avoid all of that. So once you get through CFIUS, back to our Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., if you are working with or down selected by by AFWorks or by SOCOM or by NavalX or whomever, and they start doing some diligence and they realize that you do have nefarious capital, or you do have, say, a Chinese LP on your cap table, that's a problem. And basically they send you through something what's called CFIUS review. So if you've been designated that you do have a problematic cap table, they might send you through this review process, which can take up to 9 months. And for a startup, that's brutal. And I've seen startups die through that process. So my goal, and I think the goal of Trusted Capital, is to avoid all of that. Is to incentivize investors to act appropriately. Obviously, incentivize the companies. I think companies are naturally incentivized to clean capital because the unwinding process of a divestment process down the line is far more difficult. But I think there's a lack of transparency, and I know that this is something that a lot of the startups struggle with, is knowing who those investors are that are clean. And so the Trusted Capital piece is really saying, how can we use the intelligence that we have, use the diligence that we have inside the military, couple that with intelligence and diligence that's on the private sector, and really come together and figure out how we can, as I say, turn off this fire hose of nefarious capital and keep you guys from even having to deal with this process, and definitely keep you guys from having to go through CFIUS review, because it takes too long, it's expensive, and frankly, with some of the adversaries that we're up against right now, we don't have as much time as we normally do. So the U.S. government screens capital providers and companies for national security risks prior to offering participation in the Trusted Capital program, and I'll get to all the specific information about that. Eligible companies are companies offering technologies and capabilities critical to national security. It used to be relevant. They've upped it to critical, but there really isn't obviously a specific definition of what that means. But again, we'll get into some of the areas there. Let's see, critical to national security and seeking to secure clean sources of funding in support of the defense industrial base. Eligible capital providers are investment groups that support U.S. national security sectors that align with their investment portfolio that do not have what we call nefarious capital or problematic capital. So countries of special concern, there's a few that are a little larger than some of the others, kind of the big four, I call them. But this is basically the official CFIUS list that can actually be found on the CFIUS website, which I'll share with you in a moment. But these are there's a few others that Saudi Arabia is one that's not on the list that can be problematic. Bahrain is another one that's popped up a couple times. So these are kind of the big ones. Again, this is all information. This information that's on the website there, but something for you to be aware of. I actually, in true CFIUS fashion, always have my handy dandy list with me. But I encourage you guys to become familiar with this. Okay, so down to kind of the nitty gritty and some nuts and bolts. Trusted Capital Marketplace. So they actually did launch the platform, the website, in December, so right around the holidays. But there's the address there, dodtrustedcapital.force.com. You actually don't need the S at the end. You can just enter the com and it'll kick it on there for you. And feel free, don't feel like you have to sit here and watch my awesome slides. You're more than welcome to jump over to there and start looking at it, because I'm going to be talking through a number of the things on the website there. So feel free to take a look at it. It's pretty cut and dry. On the upper right-hand corner, there should be 3 buttons. One is kind of the portal then for a capital provider, and then another portal for the companies. And then I think there's a login or something like that, the third button. So it's a pretty involved process to go through it. I've actually been working, with the team, some on user experience and the ease of going through that process. But again, this is part of the, part of the development that's happening. But, if you have feedback, please feel free to either reach out or to, talk to Sean and those guys and give them feedback, which they can pass on to me. We are actively looking for company and investor feedback on this. I'm focused on the investor feedback, but would really like to hear how companies are faring as well. So there's an area of focus, which I'm going to share with you guys in a minute, but that's the website to the list there. In a couple of places, it says that there's 27 areas of focus. That list only, for some reason, has 20 at last count. So I'll add a few more for you during the talk today. So Trusted Capital, the lead under Ellen Lord's office is a woman named Katie Arrington. She was brought in, I'd like to say probably, like April, or no, sorry, about last August. It was during COVID. I think it was August. I think one of the challenges that this program has had is that it's had 3 leads in the past, basically had 3 leads in 18 months. And as anybody knows, who's leading a company, 3 CEOs in 18 months doesn't really get it done. If you're from the investor, ecosystem, 3, fund leads in 18 months, you're not going to have any faith in that. So the challenge has been turnover. The challenge within military a lot is turnover. And so Katie Arrington is leading the effort right now. I hope for consistency reasons that she stays on and can keep moving this forward. Trusted Capital events. This is something that originally back in January 2019, when they were talking about this concept, it was more about these these pitch days or events. To be honest, kind of the reason I step back and talk about it more as trusted capital, not so much a marketplace or an event, is because this is really an ecosystem that needs to be built. It needs to be dynamic. It needs to be, available to all of us and to all of you. But it's not kind of a one-stop shop. It's not a dating service. It really is, trusted. I think anybody who's gone to raise money before understands that investing gets done, based on in-person, Zoom, trusted relationships, and investors typically invest with other investors that they know, that they've gotten to know, over 15, 20 years. They invest in entrepreneurs, sometimes that they know, hopefully that they're willing to take some risks, but there really is within the investor ecosystem a high level of trust. They share deal flow. I know they say they don't, but they do. And so I think it's really challenging to think that something like national security investing is going to be done solely, by an automated website. I just don't think that's realistic. And so my goal, I think that there are these platforms and some of these things can help with that. But just so that as you're hearing about this, separately and outside the Defense Investor Network and other entities are building out like this broader ecosystem of trusted investors. We're still working on that as well, but all of these things are in motion. So it started out with partner, events. They would partner, this kind of trusted capital concept would partner with services, combatant commands. Those events right now are on hold. I've got a couple examples later in the deck. But right now the focus really is on the platform and to populate it and to figure out, kind of get some of this kinks out of it and to make sure that it's moving quickly, moving seamlessly, hopefully not too much of a pain for the companies and for the investors. The next thought down, investor vetting and company vetting. This was kind of version 1.0, Dave Wong over at DCSA, but I just left it up there because, I like to have a real email for a real person rather than an info. And actually, you should see the email I have for you at the end. It's awful. But so anyway, Dave has been amazing around investor vetting and company vetting. I think I'm 99% sure he's still there. I haven't talked to him since early December, but unless he jumped ship, he could be a resource. So DCSA, the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, that one of the two, there's kind of a lead there, great guy, and then Dave Stapleton, who actually used to lead the Trusted Capital Marketplace Initiative inside DoD, is now over at DCSA, helping with the vetting. Great guy. But they are the entity and the agency that is doing the actual vetting behind the scenes. The TC ecosystem, this is old. This is old information. Currently includes 100 capability providers processing another 40 and 12 capital providers processing another 3 to 4. That's probably from October, I want to say October, maybe early November. But I think that highlights a bit of the challenge is that there are, the companies and their interest and willingness to go through the process far exceeds the willingness and the current interest from investors. And I think part of that has just been that the process has been not very transparent. It's been challenging. And I think back to the concept of the LPs and that not being so public, a lot of the investors aren't very comfortable putting all the information or disclosing all the information that they're being asked to disclose, not because they're doing bad things. And I've got a couple specific funds that I won't name, but that I know for a fact they're clean. But I also know that they have some LPs that are not comfortable being disclosed. And so they're a fund that has done really amazing work in the national security space. And so I'm identifying a few of those funds as we continue to work through some of these kinks. The vetting of investors at some point might actually be taken outside of DoD for some of those to help address some of those concerns, but we shall see. So as promised, areas of focus. And so when it first started, again, back about a year and a half ago, there were many fewer areas of focus. Actually, they were much bigger on my slide. This is the current list. I think there's about 20 here, but again, you'll hear on the website, it'll say 27 areas. And so I can add a little color to this. Happy to expand on any of these. They're obviously very broad. And so one thing that we were talking about, I think a couple of years ago when we all started talking about dual use. Well, let's go back further than that. 30 years ago, we thought about defense capabilities, defense technologies. You thought about aircraft carriers and ships and planes and very specific hardware things. As we've gotten more into the software age, obviously software, cybersecurity software, anything having to do with AI and ML. So I think there's been a really big tipping point in about the last 5 years. As far as what's considered dual use and what fits into a dual use bucket. Just to define a little bit dual use, the way that we use the word is basically something that has a defense application as well as at least one commercial application, usually more. That's, I still struggle with the concept of dual use sometimes, because I think some of these areas of focus that you're seeing on here are not dual use. And actually, they took the word hypersonics off of there. But that's one that's been a little bit challenging for people to kind of get, the concept of dual use around, which I understand. But I think even though a lot of these things are dual use, sometimes they are defense first. And I think that that's one real big advantage of working with the Department of Defense, is sometimes they can come in and provide capital, provide resources, and potentially be a first customer earlier than maybe a commercial application. So just so that you guys know, on the investor side, I know that it's really challenging if you are kind of a defense first capability. And we, that is another thing that we are working to, I don't say educate investors on, but, talk to them about the idea that, I'd say about 10 years ago, the idea that private side investors, they typically did not encourage their startup companies or their early stage companies to work with the government, frankly, as a whole, because they would say, it takes too long and it's frustrating. That has changed. I mean, I hope you all know that. I mean, just the fact that Capital Factory and Defense Academy exist, and all the amazing, parts of the government and the military that are housed there, and more broadly, AFWorks and Naval X, like the DoD has really stepped up, and DIU, of course, as far as figuring out how they can best engage and best work with what we lovingly call you guys non-traditionals, or early stage companies that don't traditionally engage with the DoD. So very quickly, I'll try to add a little color to some of these areas of focus, but advanced computing, obviously quantum is down there on the other side of the list there. But you're looking at edge computing, everything, anything. These are meant to be very broad, because basically, like I said, at this point in the game, that some of the adversaries that we're, I won't say fighting against, they are looking at all of these sorts of capabilities to upend our game, and to steal from us. So advanced conventional weapons technologies, obviously less dual use there. Advanced engineering materials, advanced manufacturing. Manufacturing is a massive one as we look to kind of repatriate and modernize a lot of our manufacturing capabilities here in the United States, or kind of near peer into countries that are friendlies. That's gonna be a big one. Obviously, advanced manufacturing. The more that we can bring some of those manufacturing capabilities back to the United States is a very huge focus. Navy's got a huge portfolio focused on that, but really DoD wide. Advanced sensing. We're looking, sensing, the word autonomy, there it is, autonomous systems is down there, but sensors, huge. Everything from drones to autonomous vehicles, the whole thing. So aero engine technologies, agricultural technologies, maybe not when you would have thought you'd be down there. Artificial intelligence, obviously, autonomy, biotechnologies, I think COVID has highlighted that beautifully. Chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear mitigation technologies. Communication and networking technologies, 5G, the whole across the board there, anything ISR. Data science and storage, distributed ledger technologies, energy technologies, obviously a massive category, human machine interfaces, medical and public health technologies, again, back to what we're experiencing right now. Quantum information science, of course, semiconductors and microelectronics, and space technologies. A couple other, again, hypersonics is on the other list, forging and casting. Rare earths is actually a huge one that I need to add to this deck here. But we have a number of relationships with other countries and have looked kind of at our mining capabilities here in the US. But I've seen some really interesting companies lately around rare earths, around recycling of rare earths, and then some technologies or capabilities where you don't need rare earths. And so actually the company that I helped start a number of years ago was actually an efficient motor, a switch reluctance machine motor that used power electronics instead of rare earths, which was pretty great. Trusted capital collaborations, and then more on the website, but there are kind of a handful of the COCOMs and the services that are at this point have kind of signed up to collaborate. I'm sure that list will grow tremendously as the platform grows. And so June 2020, Army Futures Command did a venture day really around COVID solutions and ventilators. There were a couple events before this, but I thought this was the most relevant to highlight. July 2020, AFWorks Venture Days, again around PPE. September 20th, Jake did a venture day around artificial intelligence. And the JAKE is the Joint AI Center, just to clarify. R&E Venture Day focused on hypersonics and microelectronics. Microelectronics is, I forget if that was on, actually, I'm going to go back here. Was that on the list? There it was, second to last. That event was actually postponed due to COVID. And then Trusted Capital, the group there has asked large prime contractors to give a list of critical suppliers to explore vulnerabilities deeper in the supply chain. And so that's actually been spending quite a bit of time looking at that. And so as you've got, we'll say, for example, a SpaceX, and they've got 400 smaller suppliers, and some of those suppliers are having a challenging time right now. And so what does that mean as far as SpaceX's ability to then produce what they've, fulfill their contracts. And so it isn't just so cut and dry. We are actually looking at some of the smaller companies that could be very specific supply chain contributors. So there's a link there, businessevents.gov, trusted capital events that can get you to current events. I'm not sure if they're doing Zoom events right now or not. I know that the event piece of it has kind of been put on hold as they're trying to build out the platform, but just wanted you guys to have that information. Let's see. Support for global allies. We're almost done here. And so I just really wanted to call attention, something that I'm very focused on as well, is that, we are the United States of America, but this is a global kind of situation where we're going to be fighting a lot of our adversaries with our allies. And so the Trusted Capital Program, we're actually working closely with NATO and their innovation team there to bring in, obviously, this morning was on a call with the UK, Australia, obviously very geographically strategic for us, obviously a big rare earth provider as well. Canada, New Zealand, those are the 5. But then also the relationships we've been building with India, with Japan, those are probably the main ones, obviously, and Scandinavia as well. But anyway, this program is meant to be and to include global allies. Just kind of an aside, I know that I don't know the makeup of the audience, to be honest, if you guys are all U.S. or if there are some folks from outside the U.S., but there are a number of initiatives going on right now, both with the DoD transition team, as well as with folks inside the new administration that around the idea of opening up potentially SBIRs or other sorts of innovation funds to allow investment in companies from other countries. So very quickly, I think this is the last one, and then I'd love to take some questions. That is, yes, that top one is an email address. I warned you. OSD.pet. I'm not even going to read it. I can send this around. I can put this in the chat. But then obviously there's the website too. There's 2 websites really, the area focus one, and then the DoD Trusted Capital where you can actually sign up. And then there's a link obviously to the countries of special concern. But I will say, if you're a company and you go to the DoDTrustedCapital.force, there is, if you scroll down just a little bit, there's a place for capital providers and then a place for companies. And there's a little tiny button that's, you'll totally miss it. It says FAQ, frequently asked questions. Click on that. That's where you're going to get most of your information. There's some great links there, some great information. There's even a, doing business with DoD link, which I'm sure you all know by heart. But anyway, it can be helpful, but don't miss that, that FAQ button. And that is it. Okay.
All right. Awesome, Heather. This is great. Really appreciate you providing all that awesome information. We do have a question here in the chat from Helena, and she asked, what can investors do to get ahead of this? Obviously, if you're raising a fund and don't have LPs, this may be an easier feat than, say, those who have existing LPs. On the flip side of the coin, what best practices do you recommend for startup founders trying to work strictly with trusted capital?
Helena, that's such great questions. So that's frankly why I started the Defense Investor Network and not the Defense, network for companies that want to work with defense. Was because, like I said, for me, the fire hose has been the investors. If we can clean up those funds, and there are a lot of funds now that are looking at national security investing, looking at dual use investing. That's different, from even a few years ago. And so as that's becoming a more popular way to go, making sure that there is nefarious capital is mission critical and is part of really the overall, mission of the fund, if you will. So it really is just knowing who your LPs are. I know that, I'm having raised a fund and having raised money for a company. It's really hard when somebody's, offering you a check with amazing terms, and that's going to help you launch your company or your fund or keep it going. We're just, trying to be very honest with folks about really the implications of that, and really the, all the complications of it, and frankly the threat to national security that it does implicate. So the funds that do exist, unwinding that, when you put money into, when you're an LP in a fund, it's like you're married for a minimum of 10 years. And so it's a very challenging thing legally, emotionally, to unwind. But we're trying to, for the sake of the companies, trying to at least create some visibility around who has what capital. And the investors don't love this, right? Like for a while, I thought it'd be, maybe 50% of, I live right here next to Sand Hill Road. And I thought, maybe 50% of the funds have, capital from one of these countries. If it's not 90%, if it's not 95%, I'd be surprised. So just kind of going into that, knowing it, kind of to some other questions that I've had before is, what percentage, if 10% of their fund is nefarious capital, does that mean that they're a problem? Sometimes we talk about information rights or visibility. If they don't have, if an investor, if an LP doesn't have information rights. So they don't get any information about the companies, the IP, anything like that. Is that really a problem? These are all questions that the CFIUS folks at DoD level, at Treasury level are kind of sorting through and trying to figure out what levels are acceptable, because the fact is it will be impossible to completely unwind this right now. So I'm more focused on shutting off the fire hose and making people aware so that funds from now on are cleaner. But at the same time, we're actually working with some folks who've been inside DoD, are going to be coming outside of DoD and setting up again some of this investor vetting on the outside, where investors are going to be a little more comfortable having frank conversations, because they don't have to necessarily disclose the name of their LP, just the country they reside in, kind of some past activity, that sort of thing, so that we can then the goal is to make that information very available to you guys, so that you can basically just write down the list and so that you because I know I've been in your position and it's impossible. It's an impossible thing. And so we're trying to figure out what is the best way to do that. I think the government has run into some problems before around confidentiality, obviously around secrecy and disclosing who the nefarious ones are. So maybe we'll make, instead of the blacklist, we'll make a whitelist, the ones that you can actually use. On the company side, founders trying to work strictly with Chester Capital. Again, this is very much a work in progress, and I really want to be clear about that. I get all sorts of questions like if I guess there was a rumor that they have some big pot of money to give out. They don't. This is not money to give out. It's basically a connecting force. That's the goal of it. Like I said, I'll be honest, that isn't happening at this point. And so it really is kind of, there's a lot of this onus put on the companies, and I'm sorry about that. And that's why I'm trying to do everything I can outside of the government to make it easier for you guys. But I think, ask the questions. I mean, I have very awkward conversations all the time. And I say China all the time. And I ask companies kind of where their capital is coming from. If you get to a point where, you've been deemed national security critical, and it'll talk about it on the website. But if you've got an interested customer, even if you don't have officially, a CIBR or a contract, if you've got a very interested government partner, and you're being approached by or have been approached by, nefarious capital, start talking about that. Reach out to me if nobody else, and I can get you in touch with the folks, inside DoD that are working on this, because it's happening constantly. We know it. And I know that you guys feel helpless a lot of the time and don't have anywhere to go. I am not the actual official right person to talk to about it, but I can make sure that you get in touch with those people. And frankly, just having that context for me is helpful as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Heather, thank you again. This has been so helpful, and I'm sure you're going to get hit up from a lot of folks who are interested in learning more and using you as a resource. So I hope you'll stick around for networking. But yeah, again, thank you so much for being here and for presenting.
It's a pleasure. Sean, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Oh, wait, we have one quick question from Anand, and that person asks, how does it apply to the strategic investment of companies who may have offices in those countries?
Interesting question. I'm not sure I get it completely. So strategic. Okay, so companies. So if you're a U.S. company selling to China, I think that's what you're asking me. That's a whole nother ball of wax, to be honest. And so understanding kind of the vendor relationships there, that's tricky. And I mean, frankly, if you have an office in that country, you can pretty much assume your stuff's been stolen anyway. Not to be blunt. But we're trying to figure out all of that, and figuring out, again, what kind of breaches have actually happened or are actually happening. I'll just be honest, I talked to a fund manager recently of a fund that I'm sure you've all heard of and is very much tied to national security. And they said that they have proof that every single one of their companies has witnessed breaches. Like it's just it's everywhere now. And so the more that we can firewall, and the more that even I'll be honest, even Silicon Valley Bank, which is a very prestigious, very well known bank here, they bank about 50% of all startups. And they in 2012 launched a fund called InnoSpring with Northern Lights, which is a Chinese venture fund. And so just the fact that as they have clients, they have put investments, and sometimes very small investments, into those companies. And so trying to figure out, how bad is that? Is that bad? I'm working with a company right now that we got some information from inside DoD that fund was invested in this company. They want to do a lot more with that company. And so now we're trying to, as quickly as we can and as quietly as we can, get that group off of their cap table. And it's hard. And they're going to be investors that don't want to come off of cap tables. One thing about the CFIUS ruling and the CFIUS rules is that they actually are quite strong. We haven't really put the teeth into them. We could. We've been very reactionary with CFIUS, but there is actually a lot of teeth in there. We can actually force those investors out. It's It's a process. It could get ugly, but we need to start doing it. So again, back to my original point, if we can avoid all of that, bottom line, it's gonna keep our company safe, or our country safer, like straight up. Sean, okay, just kidding.
Those are just internal notes.
Can startups get investment from Microsoft, for example? So Microsoft has M12 Ventures. Yeah, you can. They're fine. So if that was a clarification. Yeah, those I know a bunch of those guys very well. If you're working obviously with Microsoft, separate from their venture arm, but they're kind of a investor customer type of thing, that's fine. They're a clean U.S. company for the most part.
Cool.
I'll leave it at that.
Good to know that companies can take investment from Microsoft. Okay, we're going to wrap here, but Heather, again, this has been awesome. For those of us who are, for everybody joining on Hopin, you can click on the networking button now, and that will go until 2 p.m. Central Time. So encourage you to go in there and meet some of your fellow attendees. All right, that's a wrap. Thanks, Heather. Appreciate it. All right, bye, y'all.